Hello friends, how are you feeling tonight? I hope your body is relaxed and your mind is calm. If sleep feels far away, this story might help you drift gently into rest. Tonight, we were traveling back to the shimmering edge of the ancient Mediterranean, to a city of marble and mist, where knowledge once burned brighter than the sun itself. We're stepping into the heart of Alexandria, where scrolls whispered in candlelight, and the air smelled faintly of ink, salt, and eternity. It was here that the greatest library ever built stood, a sanctuary of wisdom, gathering every thought, every poem, every dream that humankind had ever known. Some said it was the first internet of the ancient world, a web of papyrus scrolls stretching across civilizations. Others believed it was a temple of secrets, where the mysteries of life and stars were guarded in silence. But one night, the flames came, and what was once light vanished into ash and legend. Tonight, dear listener, we'll walk softly through those quiet halls again, through the corridors of time, to hear the forgotten voices of scholars, poets, and dreamers who once lived for knowledge. So, settle in, let your breathing slow, and let the waves of history carry you gently towards sleep. And before we begin our journey into the lost libraries of Alexandria, please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's begin. The sea was breathing softly that night, as if the whole world was exhaling in sleep. The wind rolled across the dark water, carrying the scent of salt, tar, and jasmine. From a distance, the faint hum of waves touched the marble edges of Alexandria as harbor, a city of light and thought, still awake beneath the stars. The night sky hung over the great lighthouse like a silver crown, its flame flickering through the mist, guiding ships home from the corners of the world. Beneath that light, the port was quiet but never still. A few fishermen hauled in their final nets, whispering short prayers to Poseidon for calm seas at dawn. The air trembled with the rhythm of water lapping against wooden hulls. Somewhere, a lonely lyre played from a distant tavern, its notes floating on the breeze, mingling with the soft creak of ropes and sails. And within this calm, a faint echo rose, not from the sea, but from memory itself, the echo of knowledge calling out to anyone who could hear. Near the eastern wall of the harbour, a young boy hurried barefoot along the stone path. His name was Theon, an apprentice messenger for the library's scribes. In his small arms he carried a bundle of papyrus scrolls wrapped in linen. The rolls were old and fragile, covered in ink that smelled faintly of smoke and cedar oil. He walked quickly, his eyes darting toward the grand columns that loomed ahead. The great library stood there, glowing faintly in the torchlight, silent, enormous, almost breathing. He had never entered it before, yet tonight, fate would lead him through its doors. The gates of the library were guarded not by soldiers, but by scholars. They wore robes the color of pale honey, their faces illuminated by the golden flame of oil lamps. They nodded as Theon approached, recognizing the seal of Ptolemy's court on his scroll case. He bowed shyly and stepped into the vast marble hall. The air inside was cool and still, heavy with the fragrance of ink, parchment, and time. It felt sacred, as if each breath carried a fragment of eternity. All around him, tall shelves stretched toward the vaulted ceiling, their shadows mingling with the light of countless lamps. Every shelf was filled with papyrus rolls, poems, philosophies, maps, stories of stars, and equations of forgotten minds. Theon looked up and felt his chest tighten. The sound of a distant quill scratching echoed through the hall, blending with the low hum of wind beyond the columns. Somewhere deep inside him, something stirred, a feeling that he was standing in the heart of human memory. An old man appeared from the shadows, his robe trailing softly behind him. His beard was long and white, his eyes calm and distant, like someone who had seen centuries through the eyes of others. "You're late," the man said quietly, though there was no anger in his tone. Theon lowered his gaze, handing over the bundle. The scholar took it gently and smiled. "Do you know what you're carrying?" The boy shook his head. "Fragments of a lost philosopher," the old man said. "Words that once lived in Athens and have traveled farther than any ship." The boy's eyes widened, and for a moment he imagined the words themselves had wings, flying over oceans, surviving storms, waiting to be read again. The scholar turned away, but his voice lingered in the dim air. "Remember this, young one. Nothing written is ever truly lost. It sleeps until someone remembers." Outside, the wind shifted. The distant cry of a gull echoed through the courtyard. Theon followed the old man deeper into the library, his footsteps soft against the marble. He passed rooms filled with scholars bent over tables, whispering debates in Greek, Egyptian, and Sanskrit. The scent of melted wax hung in the air. Scrolls lay open like fragile cocoons, waiting for minds to awaken them. And in the center of one great chamber stood a bronze armillary sphere, its rings catching the firelight as it turned. A model of the heavens, spinning in silence. Some said the library was so vast that even those who lived within it could lose their way. Corridors branched endlessly, leading to archives of medicine, astronomy, poetry, and lore. Every scroll was a voice, every chamber a world. Theon paused beside one pillar, running his fingers along the carved hieroglyphs. Beneath the symbols of Horus and the sun, someone had etched a single Greek word, mneme, memory. He traced it gently, feeling the groove under his skin, as if touching the pulse of time itself. From somewhere behind him came the sound of pages turning, hundreds of them, rustling together like the murmur of a forest in wind. He turned, but saw no one. Only the lamplight trembled, painting soft golden patterns on the stone floor. A whisper passed through the air, or perhaps it was imagination. Theon stood still, heart racing, listening. It was said that the library had its own voice, formed by centuries of learning, a whisper that called to those who were meant to hear. The scholar returned with an oil lamp, its glow catching the dust that drifted in the air like stars. "Do you hear it?" he asked quietly. Theon hesitated. "The wind?" The old man smiled faintly. "No, child. The sea." He gestured toward the open archway beyond the columns, where moonlight spilled across the marble steps. "The library listens to the sea. Every tide brings echoes of the world, and every scholar here, every writer, tries to answer it." The boy stepped closer to the light, listening to the faint murmur of the distant waves. For a moment, it did sound like whispers, thousands of voices speaking softly through time. He wondered if they were the words of those who once wrote the scrolls now sleeping around him. He wondered if, long after he was gone, someone else might hear his own voice among them. The thought filled him with a strange warmth, part fear, part wonder. Outside, dawn was beginning to rise. The horizon shimmered with pale light as the first gulls took flight over the sea. Theon looked out through the grand pillars and saw the lighthouse in the distance, its flames still burning, bright against the fading night. He didn't know it then, but one day, both the flame and the library's light would fall into shadow. Yet in that quiet hour, everything still felt eternal. The whispers of the sea, the scent of parchment, the pulse of knowledge, all merging into one living breath. And as the boy turned to leave, the scholar's final words lingered behind him like the echo of a tide pulling back to sea. "Remember, child," he said softly, "every wave that touches this shore carries the memory of something once written, once dreamed, once loved." Theon looked back only once, his eyes tracing the endless shelves. In that golden stillness, he felt the future waiting, unseen, patient, and inevitable. Somewhere deep within the library, something ancient shifted. A faint tremor of time, perhaps, or the quiet beginning of an ending no one could yet see. And so, as the sun rose over Alexandria and the light crept into the marble halls, the sea continued to whisper. It spoke of creation and loss, of learning and forgetting, of waves that would return again and again, long after the library-ass walls had turned to dust. The city still slept, but the whispers had begun their song, and the story of the lost libraries had quietly awoken. The morning sun rose over Alexandria like a slow exhalation of gold. Light spilled through the narrow streets, painting the limestone walls in shades of amber and white. From the harbor, gulls circled lazily above the masts of ships, their cries echoing through the salt-kissed air. The city was alive again, merchants unrolling carpets from Tyre, glassmakers lighting their furnaces, philosophers debating beside fountains. Every morning in Alexandria began with noise and movement, yet within the palace there was stillness. Ptolemy I, once a general under Alexander the Great, stood by his balcony, gazing toward the sea. His hair had grown silver, his armor set aside long ago, replaced by simple robes woven from fine linen. Age had not softened his ambition, but it had changed its shape. No longer did he dream of conquest or empire. His wars had been fought, his victories written. What haunted him now was something quieter, the idea that knowledge itself could be conquered, gathered, and preserved before time devoured it. He watched the waves strike the breakwater, each one dissolving into foam, and he thought of memory. "Even the sea forgets," he murmured. His advisor, Demetrius of Phalerum, a philosopher from Athens, stood beside him, his hands clasped, his eyes sharp and thoughtful. "Then we must teach it to remember," Demetrius said. It was Demetrius who first spoke of a library, not just a storehouse of scrolls, but a living sanctuary of every known thought under heaven. The idea had begun years earlier, in the twilight of Alexander's empire, when cultures collided and wisdom scattered like seeds on wind. "A place," Demetrius had said, "where Egypt, Greece, India, and Persia will meet, not in battle, but in understanding." Ptolemy had smiled then, but the thought had never left him. Now, as the Mediterranean shimmered before him, he felt the weight of it more deeply. "A kingdom of paper," he said quietly, almost to himself, "built not by armies, but by minds." In the weeks that followed, the vision took form. Messengers were sent across continents, to Athens, Babylon, Carthage, even to faraway India, with letters sealed in royal wax, bearing the mark of the pharaoh king. "Send us your knowledge," they read. "Copy your scrolls for Alexandria, and let all wisdom live here in one light." Ships returned with cargoes of papyrus, tablets, and manuscripts, their hulls heavy with thought instead of gold. Architects and scribes worked side by side beneath the sun, shaping the library's marble wings beside the great temple of the Muses, the Mausion, the house of inspiration. It would not only hold books, it would house astronomers, physicians, poets, and philosophers, each devoted to study, each a servant of memory. Gardens bloomed around it, filled with fountains and palm trees, so that scholars could walk and think in quiet air. Birds nested in the shade, and the sound of water mingled with the soft murmur of pens. Inside, corridors were built wide enough for sunlight to wander through. Every hall bore the name of a muse, and every room was lined with cedar shelves that reached the ceiling. The scent of polished wood, ink, and oil filled the air. The library began to grow like a living forest, each scroll a leaf, each leaf a story. Scribes sat for hours, copying texts by hand, lines of poetry, geometry, medicine, and myth, each letter drawn with patient devotion. At night, the torches flickered against the walls, and the scholars' shadows danced like spirits. They spoke softly in many tongues, translating knowledge from one world into another. Greek met Egyptian, Hebrew met Sanskrit. It was said that within those walls, 1,000 voices could speak in harmony. But not all were at peace. Some priests of the old temples frowned upon this mingling of ideas, fearing that the sacred truths of Egypt would be lost beneath Greek philosophy. "You cannot bottle the gods," one of them warned. "Wisdom is wind, not stone." Yet even they, when invited inside, felt the hush of the library halls, the quiet gravity of thought, and found themselves whispering instead of protesting. Ptolemy would often visit in secret. He would walk among the scholars, disguised in a plain robe, and listen to their discussions. He loved hearing the sound of languages he barely understood, the roll of words that had crossed deserts and seas to reach this place. Once, he paused by a table where an astronomer was drawing circles on parchment. "What are you seeking?" he asked softly. The man looked up. "The movement of the unseen," he replied. "We write the stars so that the heavens remember our gaze." The king smiled. In that moment, he felt something greater than pride. A calm joy that his city, his dream, had become a vessel for such light. Perhaps this, he thought, is the only conquest that endures. Still, not all knowledge came freely. Ships entering the port were quietly searched by royal decree, and every scroll found aboard was taken to the library. The originals were copied by scribes, and only the copies returned. Some merchants complained, but others boasted that their words now lived in Alexandria's vaults, preserved beside Homer, Euclid, and the sacred writings of old. Demetrius watched it all unfold with a scholar's awe and a politician's caution. "One day," he said to Ptolemy, "your library will hold more than the world can remember. But be careful, my king. The same flame that lights the mind can also burn it." Ptolemy nodded slowly. "Then let it burn gently," he said, "for even fire, when guided, can give warmth." Years passed. The library grew until it seemed to have no end. Travelers arriving in Alexandria spoke of it as a wonder greater than the pyramids, not a monument of stone, but of spirit. Students came from far lands, drawn by the promise that no question would remain unanswered here. The city's streets filled with voices, philosophers debating beneath fig trees, mathematicians tracing figures in the dust, poets reciting verses to the rhythm of waves. And yet, beneath the beauty, there was a quiet tension, the awareness that knowledge had power. Ptolemy knew that what was gathered could also divide. In his later years, he would sit alone in the colonnade, watching the sunset bleed over the sea, and wonder whether men were ready to hold so much wisdom in their hands. "The world is full of light," he once said to Demetrius, "but our eyes are still learning to see." When Ptolemy died, the library stood as his truest legacy, a monument not of conquest, but of curiosity. The scrolls within numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It was said that when the wind blew through the upper halls, it carried the faint sound of whispering pages, as if the past itself were breathing. Scholars would often pause, pens in hand, and listen. And on some nights, when the sea was calm and the lamps burned low, those who worked late swore they could hear another sound, the distant echo of footsteps, as if the spirit of the old king still wandered through the corridors, gazing lovingly at what he had built. They said his ghost never left because his dream was not yet finished. One young scholar once wrote in the margin of a papyrus roll, "He conquered not lands, but ignorance." Those words survived centuries, passed quietly from hand to hand until even the author's name was lost. Yet the sentiment remained, a whisper from Ptolemy's age to our own, reminding us that all human greatness begins with a question, softly spoken in the dark. And outside, the sea went on murmuring against the shore, carrying the sound of pages turning to those who dared to listen. The dream had begun, and it would shine for generations, until the tide of time, as always, came to take it back. Morning in Alexandria was unlike morning anywhere else in the world. The air was clear and warm, carrying the mingled scents of sea salt, crushed herbs, and distant smoke from the bakeries. The sun rose slowly over the eastern waters, spilling its golden fingers across the rooftops, turning every dome, every window, every shard of glass into a shimmer of living fire. The lighthouse still burned, even in daylight, its mirrored flame a symbol of the city's vigilance, a reminder that knowledge never truly sleeps. By the harbor, the sounds of waking life began to rise like music. Sailors shouted to one another as they loosened ropes and mended sails. Donkeys clattered along the marble roads, pulling carts laden with amphorae of oil, honey, and wine. The cries of merchants echoed through the colonnades. Greek, Egyptian, Syrian, Nubian, Hebrew, a chorus of tongues blending into one voice. Alexandria was not merely a city, it was a meeting of worlds, a heartbeat between continents. Farther inland, the great streets stretched in perfect lines, laid out according to the geometry of reason itself. Ptolemy had ordered them to mirror the constellations, a reflection of the heavens upon the earth. The broad avenue of Canopic Way cut through the heart of the city, lined with marble columns that glowed pale in the morning light. Beneath them, philosophers gathered, their cloaks rippling gently in the breeze, debating everything from the movement of the stars to the meaning of virtue. Some argued loudly, others spoke so softly that their words seemed meant only for the air itself. In one shaded corner, an elderly man poured sand from his hand and said to his pupils, "The world is measured in grains, each thought, each breath, a single speck of time." His students listened, eyes wide, while the wind carried his words away toward the sea. That was Alexandria, a place where even the simplest gesture could become philosophy. The library stood like a temple among temples, its courtyards filled with light. Birds nested in the columns, and the rustling of their wings mixed with the sound of scholars reciting verses aloud. Inside, the scribes worked steadily. The scratching of their reeds upon papyrus formed a quiet rhythm, like rain falling on stone. Dust motes drifted through beams of sunlight, floating between the shelves like golden spirits. Each roll of parchment seemed to hum faintly, as though memory itself vibrated in the air. Beyond the library, in the marketplace, Alexandria was alive with color and scent. Spices from Arabia, cinnamon, myrrh, and saffron perfumed the air. Women in linen robes haggled for figs and olives, their laughter bright as silver bells. Street performers played flutes and danced barefoot in the dust, their anklets chiming softly with each step. The sound carried to the harbor, mingling with the rhythm of waves. Among the crowd walked men in white robes marked with blue, scholars of the museum, the companion institution to the library. They were easily recognized by the calmness of their gait and the ink stains upon their fingers. Some carried tablets, others scrolls, and still others simply walked in silence, thinking. To them, the city was one vast classroom. They could learn as much from the chatter of the marketplace as from the scrolls of Aristotle. The city's rhythm followed the sun. When noon arrived, the heat pressed gently upon the marble streets, and the air shimmered like glass. Citizens retreated into shaded courtyards, where fountains whispered coolly and vines curled over stone walls. In these quiet spaces, the people of Alexandria rested, drank watered wine, and spoke in hushed tones about new discoveries. A cure for illness, a strange plant from India, a fragment of poetry found in an old scroll. Every conversation seemed to carry the same heartbeat, curiosity. At the edge of the city, near the royal quarter, stood the observatory, a circular tower open to the sky. Here, astronomers mapped the heavens, measuring angles with bronze instruments polished to a soft gleam. They spoke little, their eyes fixed upon the movements of stars. Each night, they recorded their findings on papyrus, the position of Jupiter, the phase of the moon, the faint track of comets that passed once in a lifetime. Some nights they whispered that the universe was endless, that the earth itself was a traveler among stars. Others feared to speak such heresy aloud. Yet the library preserved every word, for truth in Alexandria was never silenced. Among the scholars who walked its halls was a man named Callimachus, a poet and librarian whose heart beat in verse. He believed that knowledge was not just numbers and records, but music. Every book, he said, has a soul that sings to the one who listens. It was he who began to catalogue the library's vast holdings, creating the first great system of classification, a map of human thought. When others asked him why he labored so patiently, he smiled and said, "Because even memory needs order, lest it dissolve into wind." But Alexandria was not only a city of men. Women too walked the corridors of wisdom. Some served as translators, others as mathematicians or healers. One such woman, known only as Irene, worked in the chamber of medicine. Each morning she ground herbs and measured powders with steady hands. She believed that the body, like the cosmos, followed hidden laws. In the evenings, she would climb to the roof of the library and watch the sea, whispering her thoughts to the waves. Some said she wrote secret notes on scraps of papyrus and tucked them into cracks between the stones, as if the walls themselves might one day read them. There were other wonders too. The city's workshops glowed with invention. Artisans crafting glass so clear it seemed born of light. Engineers building clocks powered by dripping water. Sculptors carving likenesses so lifelike that passers-by would stop and stare. Music drifted through the streets, flutes, lyres and drums, blending into the hum of the city's endless curiosity. Alexandria was alive with sound, yet beneath it all ran a deeper silence, like the pause between heartbeats. It was the silence of thought, of the human spirit searching for meaning. And still, the sea was never far. From nearly every street, one could glimpse it. A shifting blue horizon beyond the white rooftops. Sailors said that Alexandria's harbour was shaped like the open mouth of a scholar, forever drinking in the world. Ships arrived daily with gifts for the library. Scrolls from Athens, herbs from Persia, instruments from India, and stories from lands few had ever seen. Each new arrival added another voice to the city's great conversation. Yet, for all its beauty, Alexandria held its mysteries. There were whispers of forbidden texts locked in the deepest vaults, writings said to hold secrets too powerful for common minds. Some claimed that priests from older temples would sneak in at night to read the scrolls of their ancestors, leaving strange symbols drawn in wax upon the doors. Others spoke of an underground chamber beneath the library, where astronomers recorded prophecies of stars yet unborn. Whether these tales were true or not, no one knew, but they spread like perfume, faint, alluring, and impossible to forget. As the sun set, the city transformed again. Torches flickered along the streets, and the marble turned gold beneath their glow. In the courtyards, musicians played while families gathered to eat lentils, bread, and figs. The scholars of the museum dined together as well, sharing their discoveries in quiet excitement. Theon, the boy from the harbour, now older and wiser, walked among them, his eyes still wide with wonder. He carried new scrolls from foreign lands and listened to stories of inventions that might change the world. The stars, one astronomer told him, are not gods, but mirrors. They show us what we might become. Later, when the city fell silent and only the sea remained awake, Theon stood again at the steps of the library. The night wind brushed against his face, cool and fragrant with salt. Above him, the lighthouse burned steady, its light cutting through the darkness. He thought of how far the library's reach had grown, how many minds it now held within its marble heart, yet he also sensed something fragile, a truth too delicate to speak aloud. For all that humanity could build, it could just as easily destroy. In that thought, there was a quiet foreshadowing, a whisper of the centuries yet to come, when flames would rise and silence would fall upon these halls. But that was still far away. For now, Alexandria was alive, golden and eternal, the city of light and sand, standing between the sea and the stars, radiant in its moment of perfect peace. And somewhere, in the hush that followed, a faint sound echoed from within the library, the rustle of a page turning itself, as though history were already beginning to write its next line. There were places in Alexandria where time itself seemed to breathe more slowly, and none more so than the library. Scholars called it the House of Wisdom, not only for what it contained, but for what it inspired. From dawn until long after dusk, the great marble halls pulsed with a quiet energy, a soundless vibration made of thought and ink, of whispers and quills, of pages turning like waves. The library was alive, though it had no pulse. It listened, remembered, and dreamt. Theon, now a young man, walked the corridors each morning with a lamp in hand. His duties had changed. No longer a messenger boy, he was now a junior scribe, responsible for copying the scrolls that arrived daily by ship. He would light the oil lamps one by one, until the long aisles of shelves glowed like corridors of amber. The scent of cedar wood mixed with the faint smoke of wick and oil, creating an atmosphere that felt both sacred and comforting, like the hush of a temple before prayer. Every day began with ritual. The senior librarian, a man named Zenodotus, would strike a bronze bell to mark the start of study. The sound echoed through the halls and into the open courtyards, summoning scholars from every corner of the complex. They came dressed in their robes of white and ochre, carrying tablets, brushes, and reed pens. Some came from Egypt, others from Greece, Persia, or beyond the Red Sea. They spoke in many tongues, yet within the library their purpose was one: to preserve the wisdom of the world. The main chamber was vast, its ceiling painted with constellations, gold stars set into a deep blue sky. Rays of sunlight filtered through latticed windows, moving slowly across the floor as the day passed. Scrolls lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each labeled carefully with the title, author, and origin written in fine ink. There were works by Homer and Hesiod, the geometry of Euclid, the histories of Herodotus, the laws of Egypt, the hymns of Babylon, and the meditations of philosophers whose names time would soon forget. In the copying rooms, silence was a rule, but not an emptiness. Theon would sit among rows of scribes, each bent over a sheet of papyrus stretched upon a board. They worked with slow, deliberate precision, dipping reeds into ink made of soot and gum, their strokes smooth and rhythmic. The soft scratching of their pens filled the air, a sound like a gentle rainfall. Every so often, a scribe would lift his head, stretch his stiff fingers, and glance toward the light streaming in from the courtyard. Then, with a small sigh, he would return to his task. Sometimes, a foreign scholar would enter the room carrying a rare manuscript, perhaps a scroll rescued from a shipwreck or a text brought from distant lands. The scribes would gather around in reverent silence, as though beholding a sacred relic. The document would be unrolled carefully upon a long table, its edges weighted with polished stones. A translator would stand nearby, murmuring the meaning of each line while another scribe wrote the Greek equivalent. Every translated phrase was a bridge between worlds, every copied word a thread connecting past and future. Outside, in the courtyards shaded by palm trees, philosophers debated under the soft roar of the wind. One might speak of the elements, another of the stars, another of the soul. Their words rose and fell like tides, blending with the sound of birds and distant sea spray. The library's gardens were filled with fountains, and the water reflected sunlight in small, trembling patterns upon the marble walls. Sometimes, Theon would sit by one of these fountains during his midday break, watching the ripples expand outward, perfect circles fading into silence. It reminded him of thought itself, how one idea, born quietly, could spread across generations. In another part of the complex stood the Hall of Science, a place of instruments, glass vessels, and strange smells. Here, men in linen robes experimented with mixtures of herbs and minerals, studying the healing powers of plants or the movements of celestial bodies. Bronze tools clinked softly, and flames flickered under glass bowls. Observation is the first teacher, one of the physicians often said. We must watch before we decide. Theon would sometimes pause in the doorway, mesmerized by the shimmer of sunlight passing through colored glass, scattering rainbows across the walls. To him, it looked like the library itself was breathing light. At night, when the city outside quieted, the library remained awake. Lamps burned low and steady. The sea wind entered through the arches, carrying the scent of salt and memory. Those who worked late often spoke of hearing faint whispers, not of people, but of pages, rustling softly as though conversing among themselves. The books talked to one another, some said in jest, but others spoke it with a quiet awe. Perhaps they remember us, Theon once whispered, half in dream. Among the many scholars who visited, one stood apart, a philosopher named Eratosthenes. He was tall, thin, with a thoughtful smile and eyes that seemed always to measure the horizon. He spoke gently and often to Theon, sharing ideas about the Earth's shape and the distances between stars. Everything, he said, is connected by geometry. Even the soul must have proportion. It was Eratosthenes who first taught Theon to map the world by shadow, to measure the curve of the Earth from the way light falls. See how the sun speaks to us, he said, drawing a line upon the ground. The Earth listens and answers. Theon was fascinated. Night after night, he helped Eratosthenes record his findings, marking numbers and angles with careful ink. Sometimes they would climb to the roof of the library together, looking out over the sea. The lighthouse burned in the distance, steady and eternal. We live inside a circle, the philosopher would murmur. All things return, even what is lost. Those words would stay with Theon for years, long after the flames that would one day consume the library. The library also held a chamber known as the Hall of Memory. It was smaller, quieter, and few were allowed inside. Here, the oldest and rarest scrolls were kept, writings said to predate even the pharaohs, scripts no one living could fully read. The air inside was cooler, touched with the faint scent of myrrh. Scholars entered barefoot, out of reverence. They would unroll the fragile papyri upon cushions and trace the ancient lines with trembling fingers. Some said these texts contained knowledge not meant for the world, the secrets of the stars, the nature of the soul, or the forgotten songs of the gods. Others said they were merely myths, preserved for curiosity. But in that dim chamber, myth and truth felt almost the same. One night, Theon was sent there by Zenodotus to deliver a sealed document. As he stepped inside, he felt a shiver run through him. The torches flickered, and shadows wavered on the carved walls. He laid the scroll upon the table, then paused, hearing something faint. A soft hum, like distant music. It seemed to rise from the shelves themselves. For a long moment, he stood in silence, unsure whether it was his imagination or the library speaking in its sleep. He told no one, but from that night on, he would sometimes return after hours, just to listen. The sound was never the same, sometimes like breathing, sometimes like water flowing through stone. He began to believe that knowledge itself was alive, that it grew and changed just as people did. The library was not merely a collection of texts, but a vast, invisible organism, one that fed on curiosity and whispered its memories to those who stayed long enough to hear. Outside, the moon rose over the sea, casting silver light upon the courtyards. The waves lapped softly at the shore, as if repeating the library's silent song. Theon stood by the window, gazing toward the water. All knowledge returns to the sea, he thought. Perhaps that is why it never stops whispering. Somewhere below, in the lower halls, a lamp went out. Another scribe yawned and set down his pen. The night deepened, but in the stillness, the library continued its endless vigil, guarding the fragile spark of human thought. Every shelf, every scroll, every speck of dust carried a piece of a dream too vast for any one mind to hold. And as the stars drifted slowly overhead, the House of Wisdom remained awake, luminous, patient, and alive, a quiet heart beating within the body of time. The Library of Alexandria was more than a building of stone. It was a living constellation of minds. Each scholar, each scribe, each teacher was like a small star within that constellation, glowing softly, unseen beyond its marble walls, but eternal in its purpose. They were known simply as the guardians of knowledge, not because they wielded power, but because they carried the flame of wisdom as one carries a fragile lamp through darkness. Each morning, When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the guardians would gather in the outer courtyard. The sea breeze carried with it the smell of salt and papyrus, of ink and the faint smoke of oil lamps. They stood in silence for a moment, heads bowed, as though in prayer. The ritual was ancient, a moment of gratitude to the gods of learning, to Thoth and Athena, to every unseen force that protected the written word. No words were spoken, only the sound of sandals brushing against the marble. Among them was Theon, still young but no longer uncertain. His eyes had grown sharper, his handwriting steadier. He had learned to read scrolls in languages that once looked to him like knots and rivers, symbols of another world. He now spent his days assisting Zenodotus in cataloguing new texts, ensuring that each was recorded in the Great Index, a massive volume that listed every known work and where it could be found. This index was itself a treasure, a map of human thought. To lose it, Zenodotus often said, would be to lose the mind of the library itself. There was also Callista, one of the few women permitted to work among the scholars. She came from Cyrene, a city far to the west, and was famed for her memory. It was said she could recall entire passages after a single reading. Her task was to oversee the hall of recitation, where scribes trained their minds through repetition. She moved quietly among them, her voice soft but precise, her tone carrying the calm authority of one who listened more than she spoke. When Theon first met her, he was struck by her stillness. She had the kind of presence that seemed to absorb sound. "Every word has a pulse," she told him once as they worked together copying a rare medical text. "When we speak it aloud, we keep it alive. When we write it, we give it a body." Theon had never thought of writing that way before. To him, it had been a craft, careful, disciplined, and demanding. But to Callista, it was sacred, the bridge between memory and matter. The Guardian's days were long but peaceful. The sun would move slowly across the courtyard, casting patterns of light and shadow through the columns. The distant sound of the sea mixed with the murmur of voices, the occasional chirp of a bird that had wandered in from the gardens. Around midday, the great bronze bell would sound, and the scholars would gather for the meal of silence. They ate simply, bread, olives, figs, and watered wine, sitting together at long wooden tables without speaking. It was believed that the mind digested wisdom better when the mouth was still. After the meal, some would walk along the colonnades for reflection. Others returned to their chambers to study. Theon often spent his afternoons assisting Eratosthenes, now chief librarian, in measuring the earth and recording the positions of stars. Together, they would trace maps across papyrus, marking the known edges of the world. "Every horizon is an invitation," Eratosthenes would say, his eyes fixed on the line where sea met sky. "But to reach it, we must first know where we stand." In the evenings, the library became softer, almost dreamlike. The lamps were lit one by one, their flames reflected in polished stone floors. The guardians moved slowly through the aisles, checking each lamp, ensuring no spark would stray to the scrolls. Fire was their constant fear, the single enemy that could undo centuries of thought in a single breath. "Guard the flame," Zenodotus would whisper during inspections, "but never let it wander." There was a small room near the eastern wing known as the Chamber of Preservation. Here, the most fragile scrolls were treated with oil and pressed between thin sheets of papyrus. The air smelled of resin and cedar, and the work required steady hands. Callista often worked there, humming softly as she brushed each page with oil. Theon would sometimes watch from the doorway, mesmerized by the way the lamplight caught the curve of her hands as she worked, gentle, reverent, as though tending to something alive. But not all days were tranquil. Occasionally, a scroll would arrive damaged, its ink faded, its papyrus cracked from years of neglect. The guardians would gather around like physicians at a bedside, whispering, testing, debating how best to save it. Some would attempt to copy what remained, others would use heat or steam to make faint letters appear. There were times when entire passages were lost forever. Those were the quietest moments of all. The scribes would lower their heads, and a kind of mourning would pass through the room. For them, every lost word was a life extinguished. Once, Theon asked Zenodotus if he believed their work truly mattered. "There are so many scrolls," he said softly. "Thousands, tens of thousands. Does anyone beyond these walls even know they exist?" The old man smiled, his eyes glinting like the sea. "Perhaps not," he replied, "but knowledge does not serve fame. It serves continuity. We are bridges, Theon, not destinations." Those words lingered in Theon's mind long after. He began to understand that the Guardians' purpose was not to be remembered, but to remember. Their lives were quiet, almost invisible, yet the world's memory rested in their hands. Some nights, after everyone had gone, Theon would remain behind to tidy the hall. He would move slowly between the shelves, adjusting the scrolls, extinguishing the last lamps. The library in darkness was a place of wonder. Vast, silent, infinite. The faint glow of the moon slipped through the high windows, casting pale ribbons of light across the marble. Dust drifted like stars in the air. He sometimes imagined he was walking through the heavens themselves, each shelf a galaxy, each scroll a sun. One evening, while working late, he found Callista sitting by a window, her gaze lost in the sea beyond. "You should rest," he said quietly. She smiled without turning. "How can I?" she replied. "Every night I hear them whispering." "The scrolls?" he asked. "No," she said softly. "The minds within them, the ones who wrote, the ones who read. They never truly leave." Theon sat beside her. The waves shimmered silver beneath the moon. "Do you think they'll remember us?" he asked after a long silence. "Perhaps not by name," she said, "but by presence. Every reader becomes a part of what is read. One day, when someone opens a scroll we copied, they'll breathe the same dust we breathed. In that breath, we live again." Outside, a gust of wind rustled through the open archways, stirring the lamps. The library seemed to sigh, a deep, ancient exhalation. Theon closed his eyes, feeling the rhythm of it, the heartbeat of the past. Days turned to months, and months to years. The Guardians continued their work, their numbers changing as new scribes arrived and old ones passed away. Yet the rhythm remained the same: study, silence, preservation, devotion. Even as the world beyond Alexandria shifted, as kings rose and fell, as wars whispered in distant lands, the library endured, untouched, serene. To the outside world, it was a symbol of pride and power, but within its walls, it was something else entirely: a sanctuary of stillness, a cathedral built not of faith, but of reason and wonder. The Guardians knew this truth. They did not seek recognition. They sought only to keep the flame alive, knowing that someday, somewhere, someone would need its light. And as the night descended over the city, as the lighthouse shone across the sleeping sea, the Guardians of Knowledge carried on, quiet, devoted, and unseen, the silent keepers of humanity's eternal dream. Within the vast corridors of the library, not all scrolls were equal. Most were catalogued, studied, and copied with diligent care, their knowledge available to any who sought it with patience. Yet some scrolls existed in a different realm, not hidden by law, nor sealed by decree, but by the quiet respect and caution of the Guardians themselves. These were the scrolls of light and shadow. They were called so because their words could illuminate the mind or unsettle it, depending on the reader's readiness. Some contained philosophies so radical that they challenged the very understanding of gods and men. Others recorded strange observations from distant lands, phenomena that defied explanation. Still others held instructions for crafting instruments, healing the body, or understanding the stars, knowledge that, if misused, could bring chaos. The Guardians treated them with a blend of awe and care, aware that the future often trembled in the ink of these fragile texts. Theon was first introduced to these scrolls by Zenodotus, who had watched the boy grow with quiet pride. "There are things in the library that even I do not fully understand," the old librarian said, leading him down a narrow stairwell to a lower chamber. The walls were carved from cool stone, and the air smelled faintly of cedar, oil, and aged parchment. The faint light of an oil lamp flickered against the shelves, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. Here, the scrolls were kept in a precise order, though not one that a casual observer could comprehend. Some were tied with ribbons of deep blue, others with cords of crimson or gold. Each ribbon signified the nature of the text. The light ones contained safe knowledge, though remarkable in depth. The darker cords marked texts that carried risk, whether intellectual, spiritual, or practical. Theon's first encounter was a scroll tied with a black cord. He unrolled it carefully, hands trembling, as Callista watched from across the chamber. The text was written in an unfamiliar script, and he felt, almost immediately, a strange sensation, as if the words were alive, wriggling faintly beneath his eyes. The ink shimmered slightly in the lamplight. It was a treatise on the stars, but not in the conventional sense. The author had mapped celestial patterns that even Eratosthenes had not known, suggesting motions beyond the immediate perception of human instruments. Theon felt a shiver. This was knowledge that dared to dream ahead of its time. Yet alongside wonder, a subtle unease lingered. The scroll hinted at truths that might unsettle beliefs, and in those words, he sensed the delicate boundary the Guardians maintained. To know, but to respect. Callista whispered, "Every discovery carries a shadow. The more light it sheds, the darker the corners it reveals." Not all of the scrolls of light and shadow were so abstract. Some were practical, recording secret recipes for medicines, methods for distilling perfumes, or techniques for measuring time and distance with astonishing precision. One scroll described a method to preserve fruits using honey and resin, a recipe that had been lost elsewhere, forgotten by ordinary hands. Another held diagrams for water clocks, their delicate mechanisms illustrated in meticulous ink strokes that suggested patience and devotion over decades. The Guardians, Theon learned, did not fear knowledge, but misunderstanding. A single misread instruction could bring illness instead of healing, or a misapplied observation could corrupt understanding rather than expand it. So the scrolls were treated not as property, but as living teachers, and the Guardians were their interpreters. Each reading, each transcription, was accompanied by careful study, discussion, and reflection. At night, when the library was quiet and the city slept, Theon would sometimes return to the chamber. The flickering lamps created a rhythm like a heartbeat. He would unroll a scroll and read slowly, aloud if the words allowed, listening as though the letters spoke directly to his mind. Some nights he found poetry hidden within mathematics, or philosophy intertwined with geometry. Other nights, the scrolls offered insights that seemed impossibly ahead of their time, touching ideas that would not be fully realized for centuries. On one such evening, he unrolled a scroll tied with a crimson cord. The text was a discourse on the nature of light itself, describing experiments using glass spheres and oil lamps to manipulate reflections and focus beams. It hinted at lenses, magnification, and the movement of the eye, knowledge that seemed impossibly advanced, yet entirely coherent within the careful reasoning of its author. Theon traced the diagrams with his fingers, imagining the experiments in the stillness of the hall. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of waves reached him, echoing as though the library itself breathed approval. Other scrolls were less comforting. Some contained accounts of strange phenomena in far-off lands, reports of unusual tides, rare animals, or astronomical events that defied expectation. A few hinted at philosophical ideas that challenged the gods, or speculated on life beyond the visible world. To read them required courage and discretion. Many Guardians believed that these texts could disturb not the mind, but the soul, if approached too hastily. Theon grew to understand the delicate balance of their care. The scrolls of light and shadow were not kept hidden for fear of censorship, nor for pride, but for reverence. The knowledge they contained was powerful because it demanded reflection and humility. To read without preparation, without patience, was to risk misinterpretation. And misinterpretation could harm not only the individual, but the city's fragile harmony of thought. Callista would often caution him, "Remember, Theon, the scrolls do not yield all at once. They test the reader's patience. They reward those who walk slowly through their words, who listen as much as they read." Theon followed her advice carefully, feeling each letter, each line resonate. Over time, he came to hear the faint hum of ideas vibrating through the air, subtle, like the quiet pulse of the library itself. The chamber also held scrolls from foreign lands, written in languages that seemed almost musical in their unfamiliarity. There were scripts from India describing medicine, from Persia describing astronomy, and from Nubia recording histories unknown to Greek scholars. The Guardians translated them, studied them, and in so doing, wove a tapestry of human understanding that stretched across continents. Each scroll was a thread, fragile yet enduring, in the fabric of the library's consciousness. And yet, for all the light they offered, shadows lingered. Some texts recorded rituals, magic, or celestial alignments, knowledge that could be misapplied. Theon sometimes wondered whether the shadows were merely metaphorical, or if they contained a danger beyond comprehension. Callista reassured him with quiet authority. "The shadows remind us to proceed gently. They teach respect." As months passed, Theon came to see that the scrolls of light and shadow were not merely objects. They were guides, companions, and sometimes teachers of humility. Each reading left an impression, shaping the mind and the soul. Every page turned was a step along a quiet path, a bridge to understanding, a whisper from the past to the present. At night, when the lamps were extinguished, the chamber fell silent. Yet Theon felt the presence of those who had written the scrolls centuries before. He imagined them sitting by candlelight in distant lands, their hands steady, their hearts full of hope that someone, someday, would read their words. And as he lay down to sleep, the hum of their thoughts seemed to drift through the halls, mingling with the rhythm of the sea outside, carrying with it the gentle reminder that knowledge, once earned and preserved, could never truly be lost. And so, the Guardians continued their vigilance, tending to the scrolls of light and shadow with unwavering care. They walked the line between illumination and danger, between understanding and misinterpretation, knowing that the library's power lay not only in what it contained, but in the minds of those who approached it with patience, respect, and curiosity. Somewhere in the chamber, a faint wind stirred, brushing across the edges of the scrolls. And in that subtle movement, Theon imagined the library breathing, alive with stories, ideas and dreams, both light and shadow, waiting patiently for those willing to listen. The city of Alexandria was cradled by the Mediterranean, a place where land and sea met in gentle rhythm. Ships arrived daily, their sails flapping softly in the wind, bringing cargo from Egypt, Greece, Persia, India, and beyond. Each vessel carried not just goods, spices, textiles, and metals, but also ideas, letters, and manuscripts, small vessels of human thought that would find their way to the library. Theon often stood on the docks in the early morning, feeling the salt breeze brush his face, and listened to the creaking of wood and the soft slap of waves against the hulls. Sailors shouted to each other, their voices rolling across the water like distant drums, while merchants haggled quietly, negotiating prices in tongues that twisted like intricate melodies. Even the smell of fish, seaweed, and tar seemed infused with possibility, a scent of arrival, of connection, of knowledge on the move. Every ship brought new scrolls, carefully wrapped in oilcloth or hidden within crates of textiles. Some were private letters from kings or philosophers. Others were records of discoveries, maps of unknown coasts, or recipes for medicines learned in faraway lands. Each text was a story waiting to be read, a spark of distant thought that would mingle with the library's growing collection. The Guardians received these treasures with reverence, knowing that each carried a voice from across the sea, a whisper from another mind, another world. One morning, a ship arrived from India. Its sails dyed in vibrant reds and blues, and its crew speaking in a language both musical and unfamiliar. Among the cargo were bundles of palm leaf manuscripts, delicate and fragrant with the scent of ink and resin. Theon and Callista unwrapped them carefully, inhaling the faint aroma of spices still clinging to the fibers. Each manuscript was a labyrinth of symbols and illustrations, diagrams of plants, stars, and philosophical reflections. Zenodotus, watching silently, nodded with approval. "These are gifts," he said softly, "and lessons. Let us listen closely." The scribes gathered around, translating and copying with care. Some of the ideas seemed familiar, echoing teachings already present in Alexandria, while others were entirely new. Accounts of medicinal herbs unknown to Egyptian physicians. Descriptions of celestial alignments calculated with astonishing precision. The Guardians treated the arrival of each scroll like the opening of a door into a new world, moving with deliberate reverence as though each letter could vanish if mishandled. Not all voices arrived quietly. Sometimes travelers came in person, philosophers, mathematicians, astronomers and poets, carrying the knowledge of distant cities. They were welcomed into the library with a ritual of quiet respect. Guests were led through the marble halls, their eyes widening at the towering shelves, the soft golden light of lamps, and the faint hum of scholarly activity. Theon often accompanied them, serving as a translator and guide, and marveled at the way new ideas moved through the minds of the Guardians as easily as water through the fountains in the courtyards. One visitor, a scholar from Persia named Ardashir, brought a scroll describing the motions of the planets. He spoke softly, gesturing to diagrams of the heavens that seemed impossibly accurate. Theon watched the other scholars lean forward, eyes bright with curiosity, as Ardashir traced the orbits with his finger. Some of the older Guardians whispered to each other, cautioning against drawing conclusions too quickly. But Theon noticed the spark in their expressions, the thrill of understanding something previously unknown. Ships from Greece brought their own voices. One morning, a vessel arrived from Athens carrying a scholar who had traveled overland through Macedonia and Egypt. She was a mathematician and musician, carrying a set of wooden tablets covered in inscriptions of ratios, harmonies, and melodies. The Guardians allowed her to demonstrate in the Hall of Recitation, where the gentle acoustics amplified her soft singing and the measured tapping of her stylus. The library seemed to hold its breath, listening to a harmony that had never been heard within its walls before. Trade routes were not just for commerce, they were for ideas. Theon came to understand that Alexandria's power lay not in armies or walls, but in its ability to gather and transmit voices from the farthest reaches of the known world. Each arrival added layers to the library's consciousness. A map from Carthage, a herbarium from Persia, a poem from Athens. Each was a whisper joining the chorus, expanding the library's reach beyond the city itself, beyond the boundaries of human memory. The Guardians took great care to integrate these voices. Scrolls from different lands were not simply placed on the shelves. They were studied, translated, and cross-referenced. A Persian treatise on astronomy might be compared with a Greek text on geometry, while a medical scroll from India was examined alongside Egyptian herbals. The process was slow, deliberate, almost meditative, but it allowed the library to grow as more than a repository. It became a living dialogue of humanity, a meeting place for minds across time and space. Even the smallest interactions mattered. Sailors, often ignored by others, sometimes carried personal observations, notes on tides, winds, or strange animals spotted along the coasts. Theon would copy these, carefully recording the details in marginalia, aware that even a single sentence could hold insight for generations to come. These small contributions, humble yet precise, wove the edges of the library's fabric, giving texture to a tapestry of knowledge that would be nearly impossible to reconstruct once lost. Theon noticed that each arrival changed the atmosphere of the library in subtle ways. New voices brought new ideas, but also new energy, new questions. He sometimes watched as Callista and Zenodotus received a scroll from a distant city, and the room seemed to breathe differently. A slight tightening in the air, a pause in the usual rhythm followed by the gentle unfolding of curiosity. Ideas spread slowly, like ripples across a calm pond, touching every mind in turn. The sea itself seemed to join in the library's life. On quiet nights, Theon would stand on the balcony, listening to the lapping waves and imagining distant harbors, cities where unknown minds were composing, observing, and writing, unaware that their thoughts would one day arrive here. The breeze carried faint scents of spices and salt, whispers of languages and songs, a reminder that the world was vast and knowledge traveled as faithfully as the waves. Sometimes, travelers shared more than texts. They brought instruments, small artifacts, and even seeds, tangible pieces of other lands. A Persian astronomer gave a brass astrolabe, engraved with delicate markings that measured the heavens with astonishing accuracy. A poet from Athens carried a lute, its strings soft under his fingers, filling the library with gentle melodies as the guardians paused in their work to listen. Even a single plant seed could become a lesson in botany, reminding the scholars that knowledge was not just in words, but in objects, in movement, in life itself. Theon came to love these arrivals, seeing in them the library's reach beyond its walls. Each ship, each scholar, each parcel of thought was a bridge across seas and generations. He began to record not just the texts, but the travelers' stories, noting their observations of distant lands, their methods, and their questions. In doing so, he realized that the library itself was like the sea, vast, deep, and constantly moving, carrying voices from everywhere to everyone who listened. And so, day by day, the library absorbed the world. It did not conquer nor dominate, it welcomed. It did not force understanding, but invited it. Theon understood, with quiet awe, that these voices, the sailors, the scholars, the poets, and the distant minds whose scrolls had survived storms and time, were the lifeblood of Alexandria's wisdom. Without them, the library would have been no more than stone and ink. With them, it became eternal, a mirror of humanity itself. Even as night fell and the city grew silent, Theon would linger in the corridors, listening to the echoes of distant voices, whispers from lands far beyond the horizon, carried on waves and winds, now resting quietly in the heart of the library. And in the stillness, he felt the library breathing once more, alive with voices across the sea, a living testament to the unending dialogue of human thought. Not all of Alexandria's wonders were displayed in public. Beyond the bustle of the harbor, beyond the arrival of exotic scrolls and curious travelers, the library had another heartbeat, a softer, quieter pulse that belonged to the silent scholars. These were the men and women who moved through the halls with careful steps, their voices muted to whispers, their minds focused on contemplation, study, and the preservation of knowledge. Theon came to understand them slowly, watching as they emerged each morning like shadows of thought, gliding past marble columns toward their work. They were not celebrities, nor did they seek recognition. Their reward was the very act of learning, the gentle expansion of understanding, and the subtle joy of connecting with ideas that had traveled across lands and generations. Callista was one of them, though she sometimes ventured into more public duties. In her private hours, she sat among shelves in the quietest corners of the library, reading slowly, tracing each letter with her finger, listening to the rhythm of words. To her, a scroll was not a text, but a living conversation with the mind that had composed it. She read aloud softly, just enough to hear the music of language, then paused, reflecting, memorizing, contemplating. Theon observed this ritual and tried to emulate it. At first, he read with haste, eager to absorb everything at once, but the older scholars shook their heads gently. The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a garden to be tended, Zenodotus reminded him. Rushing ruins the roots. So Theon learned to slow, to breathe with the rhythm of the library, to let knowledge seep into him gradually, as dew is absorbed by the earth. The silent scholars often gathered at dawn in the courtyard. They did not speak, but sat in meditation, letting the first light of the sun fall on their faces. Some closed their eyes, some traced patterns in the sand with sticks, and some simply listened to the distant sound of waves against the harbor walls. The ritual was older than memory, a moment of mindfulness, a preparation for the day's work. Among them was a philosopher named Nereus, known for his contemplative silence. He rarely spoke, but his presence was commanding. He would sit by the reflecting pool for hours, observing the movements of water and sky, noting subtle changes, recording patterns in his mind before ever touching a scroll. When he finally did write, his texts were precise, deliberate, and profound, carrying the weight of reflection without need for embellishment. The scholars' workrooms were sanctuaries. Narrow windows let in filtered sunlight, illuminating desks cluttered with scrolls, ink pots, brushes, and the occasional pressed flower or pressed leaf. The air smelled faintly of parchment, ink, and the subtle tang of incense. Lamps were lit with care, their soft glow creating pools of warmth in the cool rooms. Every movement was measured. Even breathing seemed to follow a rhythm, as though the act of inhaling and exhaling was part of the preservation of thought. Some evenings, when Theon lingered in these rooms, he noticed unspoken patterns among the scholars. A nod here, a brief glance there, a shared smile over a difficult transcription. These small gestures spoke volumes, yet left the halls filled with silence. The library was alive not with noise, but with subtle connections, invisible threads linking minds across time and space. The silent scholars were also caretakers of memory. They learned to recognize the shape of each scroll, the texture of the papyrus, the faint scent of oils used in preservation. They could identify the author's hand by a curve of ink, the rhythm of script, the spacing of letters. In these details lay their mastery. Not flashy knowledge, but intimate understanding, the sort that allowed them to save what others might overlook. At times, they debated quietly. Two scholars might sit side by side, heads bent over a manuscript, exchanging thoughts in whispered tones, their conversation flowing slowly like a river. Every question was measured, every answer considered. They did not compete for dominance of opinion. They sought clarity and insight. Arguments, if they arose, were gentle, like the rustle of leaves in a breeze. Theon also noticed the subtle role of care and mentorship. Older scholars guided younger ones with patience, demonstrating a stroke of ink here, a careful fold there, a way to read between lines that revealed hidden meaning. Knowledge was passed not in lectures, but in shared quiet work, in observation, in imitation, and in the gentle correction of mistakes. This method produced scholars who not only understood texts, but who internalized the very essence of inquiry itself. Some scholars spent entire days without leaving their rooms, moving slowly from one scroll to another, transcribing, translating, and annotating. Their hands would ache, eyes grow tired, yet they continued in meditation-like devotion. To outsiders, it might have seemed monotonous, but the scholars themselves experienced profound satisfaction. Each completed transcription was a small victory. Each insight discovered was a subtle illumination, a candlelight in the mind. Theon grew to appreciate the library's quiet rhythms. He learned that silence was not emptiness, but a form of soundless communication, a way for knowledge to breathe, for minds to meet across centuries, and for ideas to settle and grow without disturbance. He found solace in this rhythm, and sometimes, late at night, he would walk among the shelves, letting the silence wash over him, feeling connected to every scholar who had ever sat here. Even in moments of fatigue, the scholars found meditation in the mundane, sweeping the floors, arranging scrolls, oiling lamps. Every task was a chance to observe, reflect, and participate in the quiet harmony of the library. Theon realized that this was the secret of the library's endurance. It was maintained not just by grand ideas, but by countless small, deliberate acts of care, performed in reverence and patience. The bonds among the scholars were unspoken but profound. When one fell ill, Others would take up their tasks without mention. When a new scroll arrived, it was a shared responsibility to study, preserve, and understand it. Their lives were intertwined with the library, their identities inseparable from the work, yet they remained humble. Recognition was irrelevant. Contribution was the reward itself. One night, as Theon lingered in the courtyard after the others had retired, he noticed the soft glow of moonlight on the marble. He heard the faint rustle of leaves, the whisper of water, and imagined the long line of scholars who had walked these halls before him, silent in their devotion, breathing life into words, preserving knowledge for generations that had yet to come. He felt a profound calm, as if the library itself were a living organism, sustained by invisible hands and quiet hearts. The silent scholars reminded Theon that greatness was not always loud, nor always visible. Sometimes it was the patient accumulation of small acts, a careful transcription, a measured observation, a whispered insight that shaped the course of human thought. And as he closed his eyes that night, listening to the faint echo of distant voices, he understood the essence of their work. The library was not only a repository of knowledge, but a sanctuary of devotion, where silence carried more wisdom than words ever could. And so, the Guardians continued, the scribes and philosophers weaving their quiet influence through the library, their presence uncelebrated but eternal, each mind a thread in the vast tapestry of Alexandria, keeping alive the flame of human curiosity and memory, one silent, deliberate step at a time. Beyond the rows of scrolls and chambers filled with philosophers, there existed a special section of the library, rarely visited by casual scholars, the cartographer's hall. It was a long, narrow chamber, lit by windows facing the morning sun, where the light fell across tables covered with maps, charts, and delicate measuring instruments. The scent of ink, polished wood, and faintly worn parchment mingled with the subtle aroma of dried herbs stored for preservation. Here, the world was rendered not only in words, but in shapes and lines, in curves, angles, and symbols that represented mountains, rivers, coastlines, and deserts. Theon often wandered through the hall, awed by the quiet precision of the work. Every map told a story, a visual narration of places far away, some seen with human eyes, others inferred from travelers' accounts or celestial observation. Each line was a careful approximation, each note a reflection of careful thought. The guardians of the cartographer's hall were meticulous. They used compasses and rulers, sometimes delicate strings and plumb lines, to ensure accuracy. They consulted accounts from merchants, sailors, and explorers, blending first-hand observation with the collected wisdom of the library. The maps were living documents, continually updated as new information arrived, each edition a ripple across the surface of understanding. One morning, Theon found Callista examining a chart of the Nile Delta. Her fingers traced the intricate channels of the river, noting subtle shifts in the waterways. Rivers change, slowly but persistently, she said softly. Even here, we must account for what is seen and what is remembered. She tapped a small mark on the map, indicating a settlement that had vanished decades ago, erased by floods or migration. A map is more than lines, it is memory. The hall contained more than local geography. Scrolls depicted distant lands, the mountains of Persia, the deserts of Arabia, the coastlines of India, the forests of Gaul. Each map was annotated in multiple languages, often with marginal notes detailing climate, trade goods, population, and peculiar customs. The cartographer's hall was a repository not only of space, but of human experience, capturing the contours of life across continents. Ships' captains frequently visited the hall, bringing journals and sketches from their voyages. They described harbors, tides, and currents with painstaking precision. Theon learned to read these logs carefully, comparing measurements of latitude, sketches of coastlines, and notes on seasonal winds. Some captains recorded observations of the stars above, providing vital information for navigation. The library's scholars would verify and integrate these reports, creating a tapestry of knowledge that extended far beyond Alexandria. In one corner of the hall, Theon noticed a collection of nautical instruments, astrolabes, quadrants, and simple sundials, carefully preserved and displayed alongside corresponding maps. He marveled at the ingenuity of these devices, each one allowing humans to measure the vastness of the heavens or the distance between distant ports. Zenodotus reminded him, "The world is a puzzle, Theon. Every instrument is a piece, and every observation is a clue." Even the smallest maps received meticulous care. A tiny sketch of a cove in the eastern Mediterranean, scarcely larger than a hand, could be as valuable as a large chart of the Nile. Every detail mattered: the angle of a promontory, the presence of a hidden reef, the timing of tidal currents. Theon learned to observe maps not only with the eyes, but with the mind, imagining the seas and lands they represented, feeling the waves beneath imagined keels, the sun beating down on distant deserts, the quiet wind across forested hills. The cartographer's hall was also a place of collaboration. Scholars would gather around a table, debating the proper placement of a river or the correct latitude of a city. Their voices were measured, soft, respectful. Arguments were resolved not through haste, but through careful calculation, comparison of sources, and reflection. In these moments, Theon understood that mapping was more than measurement. It was interpretation, a conversation between reality and understanding. Sometimes maps contain not only geography, but philosophy, the placement of cities, the direction of winds, the course of rivers, even the flow of trade routes reflected the scholar's understanding of human society. A river might symbolize abundance, a mountain isolation, a road connection. Theon observed that the cartographer's hall was as much about observing human life as the physical world, a meditation on the interplay between nature, society, and memory. Nightfall brought a special atmosphere to the hall. The lamps cast golden pools of light over the tables, while shadows stretched long across the walls. Theon would sometimes sit alone, tracing the paths of caravans and ships with his finger, imagining the people who traveled along them. He pictured distant lands, bustling marketplaces, quiet villages, serene temples, all connected in a vast network of human experience, now preserved within the library's walls. The maps were occasionally layered with layers of annotation, Greek names beside Egyptian ones, descriptions of foreign flora and fauna, brief notes on customs and festivals. A single sheet might contain information from 3 different continents, blending observation and hearsay into a coherent vision. Theon marveled at how the library managed to reconcile these diverse accounts, creating a representation of the world that was both accurate and expansive. Even mistakes held value. A misreported coastline, a wrongly placed city, or a misunderstood mountain pass became lessons in humility, teaching scholars to question, verify, and reflect. Theon realized that the cartographer's hall was not just about accuracy. It was about cultivating discernment, patience, and respect for the complexity of the world. Zenodotus often reminded Theon, "A map is a promise. It shows what is known, what is remembered, and what is still a mystery. Never forget the mysteries, Theon. They guide the search for knowledge." Theon understood that these words applied not only to geography, but to all knowledge. The world was vast, and certainty was always partial. The cartographer's hall, with its maps and instruments, embodied this philosophy, a careful negotiation between observation, imagination, and truth. The hall was quiet except for the soft scratching of ink on parchment and the gentle turning of scrolls. Theon sometimes thought of the library as a great vessel, carrying knowledge across time and space, its maps acting as both compass and anchor. Each scroll, each chart, each annotation contributed to an understanding that stretched far beyond Alexandria, touching lands, people, and ideas the scholars might never see in person. And yet, the greatest wonder of the cartographer's hall lay not in its precision or tools, but in the sense of possibility it evoked. Each map suggested journeys yet to be undertaken, seas yet to be crossed, cities yet to be discovered. Theon felt, as he often did, that the library itself was alive, breathing through the maps, whispering of horizons unseen, inviting minds to wander with respect, curiosity, and quiet wonder. In the stillness of the hall, he imagined the sailors of future centuries, guided by maps that might one day survive through fire and time. He imagined explorers, standing at the edge of unknown lands, tracing the lines drawn by scholars long gone, feeling a quiet connection to the library that had preserved these visions. Alexandria, through its cartographer's hall, had become more than a city. It was a window into the world, a gentle reminder that knowledge, carefully observed and preserved, could extend across both space and generations. And so Theon lingered as evening shadows lengthened across the marble floors, tracing imagined journeys, with a fingertip breathing in the stillness, listening to the unspoken whispers of distant lands, and feeling above all the gentle pulse of discovery that kept the library alive, infinite and patiently awaiting those willing to follow the paths it revealed. Within the vast halls of Alexandria's library, not all knowledge was captured in ink and parchment. Some existed only in sound, the subtle intonation of a poet, the rhythm of a song, the careful pronunciation of a sacred text. These were entrusted to a group of quiet guardians known as the conservators of sound. They moved among the scrolls and manuscripts with soft steps, carrying small instruments, delicate tablets, or simply their voices, preserving knowledge in the form of music and oral recitation. Theon first became aware of them on a morning when the air was still and the city had yet to stir. He heard a distant chant, barely audible at first, a melody rising and falling like the gentle lapping of waves against the harbor walls. Following the sound, he found Callista and a few other scholars seated on cushions, their eyes half closed, their voices blending in harmonious patterns. The chant was not loud. It was a quiet weaving of notes and words, precise yet meditative, resonating through the marble halls in a subtle, almost tangible presence. The conservators understood that sound carried meaning beyond words. A single syllable, pronounced with care, could reveal subtleties lost in writing. The cadence of a poem, the rhythm of a mathematical theorem sung aloud, even the inflection in storytelling. All these were preserved carefully, passed from master to pupil in rooms specifically designed for acoustic perfection. Some halls had soft stone walls that reflected sound evenly, while others were lined with tapestries to absorb echoes, creating spaces of intimacy where even a whisper could be heard with clarity. Theon watched the conservators practice, noting the precise way they breathed, the delicate modulation of their voices. Their training was meticulous. They learned to memorize lines exactly, to reproduce intonation, to carry the melody of language without distortion. Mistakes were corrected gently, almost imperceptibly, with nods, soft gestures, or quiet repetition. There was no haste, no need for applause. The work itself was reward enough. Some of the conservators focused on music. Ancient lyres and flutes were carefully maintained, strings replaced with oil-treated fibers, flutes polished and tuned. Instruments were played slowly, deliberately, allowing the resonance to fill the room without rushing. Theon noted that even the smallest vibration was considered meaningful. A single note could convey emotion, instruction, or meditation. Music, in this sense, was knowledge, a living record of human experience, preserved through care, attention, and repetition. Others specialized in oral recitation. They memorized epic poems, scientific texts, histories, and philosophical dialogues, often learning multiple languages to ensure the precise transmission of meaning. When a foreign scholar arrived, the conservators would collaborate to verify pronunciation, rhythm, and subtle emphasis. The library's oral tradition was rigorous. No detail was considered too small, and every nuance was regarded as essential. Even the mundane carried importance. The rhythm of the calendar, the chanting of prayers, and the correct pronunciation of names in ceremonial readings were preserved with care. Theon learned that these seemingly minor details shaped understanding across generations. A mispronounced word could change meaning. An omitted tone could alter perception. The conservators treated each sound as fragile and precious, like a candle flame, guiding it carefully so it would illuminate minds far into the future. Callista once explained the subtle philosophy behind their work. Words are vessels, Theon. They carry thought, emotion, and intent. To preserve a text is not enough. One must preserve its living echo, the sound that breathes life into meaning. Without sound, knowledge is flat. It becomes a shadow of itself. Theon felt the weight of her words and understood that the conservators were, in a sense, caretakers of life itself. Life as expressed in voice and music, in rhythm and resonance. The conservators also collaborated with scribes. Some texts included musical notation, instructions for chanting, or poetic meter, which required careful interpretation. Theon saw manuscripts where delicate symbols indicated pitch, tone, or timing, alongside explanations of proper gesture or inflection. The work was intricate, requiring patience, precision, and a meditative focus. To misinterpret even a symbol could distort the intended experience of the text. In the evenings, the library sometimes hosted quiet gatherings where conservators demonstrated their skills. Scholars would sit cross-legged, listening to soft chants, whispered recitations, and gentle melodies. The experience was immersive. It created a sense of presence, as though the past was speaking directly into the room. Theon felt a deep sense of calm during these moments, the sounds weaving through his thoughts, settling like leaves on still water. Travelers also contributed to the preservation of sound. Merchants from distant lands brought songs, poems, and oral histories, sharing melodies and stories that might otherwise have vanished. The conservators learned from these visitors, carefully integrating foreign techniques and styles while respecting their authenticity. Each edition enriched the library's auditory collection, creating a tapestry of sound that spanned continents and cultures. Some nights, Theon would wander the halls alone, listening to the faint echoes of voices, a fragment of a Greek poem, the distant tone of an Egyptian hymn, the whispered instruction of a Persian astronomer. Even when the rooms were empty, the library seemed to hum softly with residual sound, a gentle memory of knowledge in motion. He realized that the conservators' work extended beyond preservation. They created an invisible bridge connecting past, present, and future. The role of the conservators was not glamorous, nor was it visible to casual observers. They did not receive public acclaim, yet their contribution was essential. Without their care, texts could become lifeless symbols. Without their voices, the rhythm, tone, and nuance of knowledge would be lost. They ensured that understanding was not static, but alive, capable of breathing in the minds of those who listened. One particularly serene afternoon, Theon observed a small group of conservators performing an exercise in synchrony. Each voice was slightly offset, weaving together a delicate harmony. As he listened, he noticed how each sound supported the others, creating a subtle resonance that seemed to fill not only the room, but his own consciousness. It was as though the library itself were exhaling, its walls vibrating with gentle wisdom. Even mistakes were treated with care. If a tone faltered, a pause was inserted, a breath recalibrated, and the sound resumed, unbroken in its continuity. The conservators believed that knowledge, like music, was resilient yet delicate. It could be preserved, but only with respect, patience, and mindfulness. Theon often reflected on how this auditory preservation complemented the library's other collections. While scrolls and manuscripts captured thought in static form, the conservators ensured that knowledge remained living, dynamic, and expressive. Words and melodies carried context, emotion, and subtlety, bridging gaps that ink alone could not convey. In this way, the library became a multi-sensory repository where sight, touch, and sound all contributed to the understanding of human experience. As night fell over Alexandria, Theon lingered in the hall, listening to the soft reverberation of a final chant. The sound seemed to linger even after it ended, a delicate echo in the marble corridors. He realized that the conservators of sound were not merely preserving music or speech. They were preserving presence itself, the feeling of human thought alive in the air, delicate yet enduring. ready to guide anyone willing to listen. And so, the conservators continued, day after day, weaving voices, melodies, and whispered words into the library's ever-growing legacy, ensuring that knowledge was not only recorded, but experienced, not only read, but felt, carrying the gentle pulse of human understanding across generations, like the softest echo of a distant song. Among the vast corridors and endless scrolls of Alexandria, some of the library's quietest rooms were devoted not to poetry, philosophy, or navigation, but to the study of the human body, its ailments, and the subtle arts of healing. Here, scholars and physicians worked with care, preserving knowledge that spanned generations, combining observation, experimentation, and tradition into a delicate tapestry of understanding. Theon first entered the medical wing on a morning when the sun filtered softly through high windows, casting long golden beams across the cool stone floors. The air smelled faintly of dried herbs, pressed flowers, and the faint tang of oils and tinctures. Shelves were lined with scrolls describing treatments, anatomy, and symptoms in meticulous detail, alongside jars of preserved specimens, small surgical instruments, and delicate powders made from roots and minerals. At the center of the room, a group of physicians gathered around a table, examining a model of the human body carved from ivory. They traced lines indicating veins, nerves, and muscles, discussing their observations in gentle tones. Each gesture, each word, was deliberate, measured, and precise. They were devoted not to spectacle, but to careful understanding. Callista introduced Theon to a physician named Heraclides, a man of quiet authority who had spent decades studying the healing arts. "Medicine," he said softly, "is a practice of observation, patience, and compassion. To heal another, one must first understand the rhythms of life within them." He guided Theon through the scrolls, showing diagrams of the heart, lungs, and digestive system, alongside notes on treatments ranging from herbal remedies to gentle surgical procedures. The library's medical scholars approached their work with reverence. Each herb, each mineral, each carefully prepared poultice was considered for its properties and effects. They believed in balance, the temperaments of body and mind, the harmony of elements, the connection between health and the natural world. Treatments were not merely prescriptions, but guidance for restoring equilibrium, gently encouraging the body to find its own strength. Observation was central to their practice. Physicians would spend hours watching patients, noting the subtle shifts in complexion, pulse, or gait. Theon learned to record these details with care, understanding that small variations often held the key to understanding disease. Even the act of listening, to the breath, to the heartbeat, to the voice of a patient, was considered a form of deep meditation, revealing truths that could not be written on scrolls alone. Some treatments were as delicate as they were ingenious. Poultices were prepared with precise ratios of crushed leaves, resins, and oils. Infusions were measured with exacting care, taking into account the season, the patient's constitution, and the nature of the ailment. The library preserved not only the recipes, but the reasoning behind them, offering insight into the thoughtful, patient mind of the healer. Surgery, though rare and cautious, was approached with meticulous planning. Blades were polished, incisions mapped carefully, and instruments cleaned and arranged with precision. Theon observed how each movement was considered, each action deliberate. Even in these procedures, there was no rush, only the steady, deliberate rhythm of attention and care. The medical wing also contained an extraordinary collection of texts from distant lands. Physicians from India, Persia, and Egypt contributed knowledge of herbal medicine, surgical techniques, and diagnostic methods. Theon marveled at the diversity of approaches, all preserved under the library's careful supervision. These texts were compared, annotated, and integrated, creating a body of medical understanding that spanned continents and centuries. In quiet moments, the library's physicians would practice remedies on models or observe animals to understand anatomy and physiology without causing harm. Every observation, every small experiment was recorded in painstaking detail, ensuring that future generations could benefit from discoveries without repeating past errors. The library also maintained a subtle oral tradition. Recipes, chants, and procedures were memorized and taught by demonstration, ensuring that essential knowledge could survive even if scrolls were lost. The conservators of sound often collaborated with medical scholars to preserve the rhythm and tone of diagnostic chants or surgical instructions, acknowledging that the voice itself could be a tool for learning. Theon began to appreciate the deep empathy woven into medical practice. Physicians approached patients with gentleness, listening attentively, guiding treatments with care. They understood that healing was not only a technical skill, but a human art, a quiet conversation between practitioner and patient, body and mind, knowledge and intuition. Heraclides often reminded Theon that medicine required humility. We observe, we measure, we suggest, but the body has its own wisdom. Our role is to guide, to support, and to preserve what is fragile. Healing is not conquest, it is stewardship. Theon understood that this philosophy applied beyond medicine. It reflected the library's broader purpose: to nurture knowledge, not dominate it, to preserve, not impose. The library's medical collection included extraordinary case studies, chronicling illnesses, treatments, and recoveries. Even failures were documented with care, teaching lessons of caution, patience, and observation. Theon noticed that the tone of these accounts was always calm and reflective, never frantic or alarmist. They invited understanding rather than fear, contemplation rather than hasty action. Herbs and medicines were prepared in small sunlit rooms adjacent to the scrolls. Leaves were crushed, resins melted, and tinctures mixed with oils. Each preparation was accompanied by careful notes: the time of day, the temperature, the humidity, and the patient's constitution. The process itself was meditative, a ritual of care that connected the practitioner to both nature and the patient. Even the smallest details were significant: the shape of a leaf, the scent of a flower, the sound of water as it flowed over stones, all could provide insight into effective treatments. Theon learned to observe everything: the environment, the rhythms of daily life, the subtle cues from those under care. Medicine in Alexandria was as much about attention as technique. In the quiet evenings, Theon would sometimes walk through the medical wing, listening to soft conversation, the gentle scratching of ink on scrolls, or the muted tapping of instruments. He imagined the many lives touched by the library's knowledge: patients healed, scholars guided, generations benefiting from careful observation preserved in ink and sound. He understood that the library's value was not merely in its texts, but in the delicate web of care, empathy, and attention that connected all who had worked within its walls. Theon realized that the essence of medicine, like the library itself, was patience. Knowledge was nurtured slowly, preserved gently, and applied thoughtfully. There was no rush, no spectacle, no immediate glory. Each observation, each preparation, each act of healing was a quiet contribution to a larger, enduring purpose. As night fell, the lamps casting pools of golden light across the shelves, Theon felt a profound calm. The library's medical knowledge was not only a record of human ingenuity, but a testament to care, reflection, and the gentle stewardship of life. It was a reminder that understanding and compassion, when patiently cultivated, could endure far beyond the moment, shaping the course of generations in silence and subtlety. And so, the physicians continued, quietly tending to knowledge and life alike, preserving the secrets of the human body with reverence, patience, and humility, ensuring that even in the vast expanse of time, the delicate art of healing would remain, quietly guiding those who sought to understand and care for the fragile miracle of life. High above the bustling streets of Alexandria, beyond the reach of merchants and travelers, there existed a chamber devoted entirely to the heavens. It was here, in the astronomer's chamber, that scholars devoted themselves to the careful observation of stars, planets, and celestial patterns, seeking understanding of the vast cosmos that stretched beyond human sight. Theon first entered the chamber at dusk, just as the sun's last light spilled through tall, arched windows. The room was large, but serene, lined with shelves containing scrolls of star charts, tables of planetary movements, and instruments designed to measure the heavens with meticulous precision. The air smelled faintly of aged parchment, oils used to preserve delicate instruments, and the subtle tang of incense burned to honor the stars. In the center of the room, a circular platform held a large astrolabe, its polished bronze surface catching the fading sunlight. Lines and markings engraved with painstaking care reflected the accumulated knowledge of generations. Theon ran his fingers lightly across the instrument, feeling the careful grooves beneath his fingertips, imagining how each rotation corresponded to movements in the sky above. The astronomer's chamber was rarely noisy. Scholars moved slowly, speaking in hushed tones, consulting charts and instruments with deliberate care. Some worked by candlelight, tracing the paths of planets, calculating distances, and recording patterns in the night sky. Others observed the stars directly, using telescopes or simple sighting instruments, letting their eyes adjust slowly to the darkness, noting subtle shifts that might reveal the motion of distant worlds. Callista introduced Theon to a senior astronomer, Hypatia, a woman known for her patience and meticulous observation. "The heavens are both patient and precise," she said softly. "They move in patterns, but only the attentive can discern them. Our task is to watch, to record, and to interpret without disturbing the natural rhythm." She guided him through star charts, showing how constellations were named, how planetary movements were predicted, and how eclipses were calculated with careful observation. Theon noticed that the astronomers approached their work almost as a form of meditation. Hours passed in silence, punctuated only by the scratching of ink on parchment or the quiet adjustment of instruments. Eyes were trained to detect the faintest shimmer of a star, hands to adjust lenses with gentle precision, and minds to calculate movements with calm deliberation. There was no hurry, only the steady rhythm of inquiry. Each chart told a story. The paths of planets, the cycles of the moon, and the positions of stars were all carefully recorded, not just for scientific purposes, but to understand the deeper patterns of nature. Theon learned that ancient astronomers saw connections between celestial events and earthly phenomena. The flooding of the Nile, seasonal changes, even the timing of agricultural work. Observation of the heavens was not abstract. It was intertwined with daily life, guiding human activity with subtle wisdom. The chamber contained rare manuscripts from distant lands, Babylonian tables of planetary movement, Egyptian records of star risings, Greek calculations of celestial geometry. These texts were carefully studied, compared, and sometimes corrected, integrating knowledge across cultures. Theon marveled at the scope of information preserved here, a bridge between civilizations, united by the shared curiosity of the night sky. In the quiet evenings, the astronomers would sometimes step onto small balconies overlooking the city, their eyes lifted to the sky. They traced constellations with their hands, whispered notes to each other, and calculated the motion of planets with precision. Theon learned that even observation required humility. The heavens were vast and indifferent, and human understanding was small yet persistent. Patience, care, and attentiveness were the keys to insight. The chamber's instruments were works of art as much as tools of science. Armillary spheres, elegant spheres of bronze rings, rotated smoothly on carefully balanced stands. Quadrants, simple but precise, allowed scholars to measure angles between stars. Tables with engraved markings helped calculate latitude and longitude, mapping the sky with methodical accuracy. Every piece was maintained with gentle care, polished and adjusted daily, reflecting both utility and reverence. Theon also learned about predictive astronomy. Using observations recorded over decades, astronomers could anticipate eclipses, solstices, and planetary alignments. Each calculation was carefully verified, sometimes over months, with careful cross-checking against existing charts. Errors were noted, corrected, and passed along, creating a living tradition of knowledge that refined itself patiently over generations. Sound, too, played a subtle role. Scholars recited formulas, chants, and calculations aloud, allowing memory and rhythm to guide understanding. The conservators of sound sometimes collaborated with the astronomers, preserving the oral traditions that ensured precise transmission of knowledge, especially for complex mathematical relationships or timing sequences crucial to celestial prediction. Theon noticed a quiet poetry in their work. Watching the stars, recording movements, and interpreting patterns created a sense of wonder and reverence. The night sky was vast, yet intimate in the way it could be understood through careful observation. Each calculation, each recorded note, was a connection between human effort and cosmic rhythm, a bridge between the finite and infinite. Even mundane details were observed with care. The shimmer of a faint star, the alignment of planets, the subtle reflection of moonlight on the Mediterranean, all provided clues. Observation required mindfulness, a deep awareness of the senses, and patience to notice what might otherwise be overlooked. Theon began to understand that astronomy in Alexandria was not merely measurement, it was a gentle meditation on the vastness of existence. Hypatia sometimes spoke to the group about the philosophical significance of their work. The heavens remind us of our smallness, and yet of our capacity for understanding. Every observation is a conversation with eternity. We listen, record, and reflect, but always with respect for what lies beyond our sight. Theon felt the profound calm in these words, a serenity that deepened with each night spent under starlight. The chamber also functioned as a teaching space. Young scholars would sit beside experienced astronomers, learning to align instruments, record observations, and calculate celestial events. The instruction was patient and deliberate. Mistakes were opportunities for reflection, not embarrassment. The rhythm of learning was slow, steady, and immersive, allowing the mind to absorb not only technique, but the reverence for the sky that guided every action. As night deepened, Theon often lingered after others had retired. The soft glow of lamps illuminated charts and instruments, while the faint chill of the evening air brushed against the stone walls. He would trace paths of stars with his finger, imagining the distant suns, the slow turning of planets, and the eternal rhythm of the cosmos. In these moments, the library seemed to expand beyond its walls, connecting the mind with the infinite night above. The astronomer's chamber reminded Theon that knowledge was not only about accumulation, but about contemplation. Understanding the heavens required patience, humility, and presence. Each observation, each calculation, each recorded note was a quiet act of devotion, linking human curiosity with the eternal cycles of the universe. And so, the astronomers continued their work, quietly observing, recording, and teaching, preserving the rhythm of the heavens for generations to come. In their patience, Theon saw the library itself reflected, a sanctuary of attentive minds, a vessel for discovery, and a gentle reminder that even the vastest mysteries could be approached with calm, careful wonder. Within the vast halls of the library, beyond the shelves of scrolls and the chambers of calculation, there was a quiet space dedicated to the visual imagination, the artist's alcove. Here, scholars, painters, and illustrators worked with gentle precision, preserving images of gods, landscapes, flora, and human activity in delicate pigments on papyrus and parchment. The air carried the faint aroma of natural dyes, fresh ink, and oiled brushes, mingling softly with the subtle scent of aged parchment. Theon first entered the alcove on a morning when sunlight streamed through tall, latticed windows, illuminating motes of dust that floated lazily through the air. The room seemed suspended in a soft glow, as if time itself slowed to accommodate the careful work within. Long tables held sheets of papyrus, some blank, some adorned with intricate sketches, while jars of pigments lined the walls like a rainbow frozen in glass. Artists moved quietly, their brushes gliding across surfaces with deliberate care. Every stroke was intentional, every color carefully chosen. Callista guided Theon to observe the work of an illustrator named Alexandria, whose delicate depictions of plants and animals were both scientifically accurate and profoundly expressive. "Observe," Callista whispered. "The care is not only in form, but in the intention behind each mark. Every line is a meditation, every shade a reflection of understanding." The alcove contained a remarkable range of subjects. Botanical studies captured the veins of leaves, the curvature of petals, and the textures of bark. Illustrations of animals revealed anatomy and motion with astonishing subtlety. Cityscapes, temples, and domestic interiors were rendered with perspective and detail that brought the scenes to life, preserving not only structure, but atmosphere. Theon marveled at how each piece seemed to pulse with quiet vitality, as though the world itself breathed through pigment and ink. Some artists focused on religious or ceremonial depictions. Scrolls portrayed rituals, festivals, and sacred spaces, capturing the gestures, expressions, and ceremonial objects with exacting care. These images were more than decoration. They were visual records of practice, thought, and culture. Observers could understand traditions, clothing, and tools not only through description, but through the careful rendering of sight. The alcove was also a place of collaboration. Artists consulted with scholars in medicine, astronomy, and geography to ensure accuracy. Botanical illustrations were cross-referenced with herbals and live specimens. Maps were enhanced with visual depictions of mountains and rivers. Celestial charts sometimes included artistic representation of constellations. Knowledge flowed across disciplines, blending observation, creativity, and careful documentation. In one corner of the alcove, Theon noticed a small group working on a fresco depicting the city of Alexandria itself. The artists carefully measured proportions, studied perspectives, and referenced architectural plans preserved elsewhere in the library. Callista explained, "The goal is not only to capture reality, but to capture essence, the spirit of the place, the rhythm of daily life, the interplay of light and shadow." Each brushstroke was deliberate, slow, and reflective, like a meditative rhythm that brought the city to life on the wall. The use of color was meticulous. Natural pigments were ground and mixed with oils, resins, and water in precise proportions to achieve stability and vibrancy. Red ochre, lapis lazuli, and verdigris were treasured not only for their beauty, but for their permanence. Theon watched Alexandria test small patches of color, observing how they dried, how they interacted with the texture of papyrus, and how light would illuminate them at different times of day. Even small errors were corrected with patience, without haste or frustration. Art in the alcove was also a means of reflection. Scholars would sit quietly, contemplating scenes of distant lands, mythological stories, or detailed studies of nature. They believed that observing and creating art enhanced understanding, allowing the mind to integrate information with subtlety and emotional depth. Theon often lingered for hours, tracing delicate lines, observing the interplay of color and form, and feeling the quiet reverence with which every image was preserved. The alcove also preserved visual stories from distant lands. Traders and travelers contributed sketches and paintings, documenting unfamiliar customs, landscapes, and architecture. Theon observed depictions of Indian rivers, Persian deserts, and African wildlife, each rendered with careful attention to proportion, detail, and authenticity. These contributions enriched the library's collection, expanding the world within Alexandria's walls beyond local boundaries. Even minor details were considered meaningful. A shadow across a building, the curve of a vine, or the shimmer of water in a stream conveyed atmosphere and subtlety. The artists approached each scene as a living narrative, balancing observation with interpretation. Theon realized that art in Alexandria was not merely decoration or record. It was a gentle exploration of perception, a bridge between the observed world and human understanding. Callista introduced Theon to techniques used for preservation. Completed works were stored in low humidity chambers, sometimes rolled into scrolls, other times mounted on thin wooden frames. In some cases, Copies were made to ensure the survival of the image, even if the original deteriorated. The library's care extended beyond creation. It safeguarded art as a living part of knowledge, not just as ornamentation. The alcove was also a space of quiet teaching. Young apprentices sat beside experienced illustrators, learning to observe, mix pigments, and render forms with care. Mistakes were seen as opportunities to refine perception, patience, and technique. The rhythm of instruction was slow and deliberate, a gentle guidance that cultivated both skill and mindfulness. Theon noticed the subtle poetry in visual representation, a depiction of a river flowing through a valley, a bird perched on a branch, or the soft folds of fabric on a statue conveyed not only information, but a sense of presence. In the careful attention to detail, in the patient layering of color and line, he sensed a connection to the world that was both immediate and timeless. Sometimes, the artist's alcove served as a bridge between disciplines. Astronomical charts were enhanced with pictorial representation of constellations. Botanical illustrations complemented medical texts. Maps included topographical sketches. Knowledge became multidimensional, experienced not only through reading or calculation, but through seeing, contemplating, and internalizing subtle visual cues. Evenings brought a special quiet to the alcove. Lamps cast a soft golden glow across tables and shelves. Shadows lengthened across sketches and scrolls, creating an atmosphere of reflection and calm. Theon would sit quietly, tracing imagined paths along rivers, through forests, and across cities, letting his mind wander gently with the rhythm of brushstroke and pigment. He realized that the artist's alcove preserved more than images. It preserved perception itself, the ability to observe, to interpret, to feel the quiet resonance of a scene or object. Every illustration, every chart, every fresco was a meditation on form, a tribute to observation, and a gentle reminder that knowledge could be both precise and beautiful. And so, the artists continued their work day after day, blending observation, imagination, and careful preservation. Through their calm, deliberate efforts, the library's walls became not only a repository of words and numbers, but a sanctuary of visual understanding, a place where the mind could wander through both reality and reflection, and where the beauty of the world was held with patient reverence, awaiting those willing to look, notice, and absorb its quiet wisdom. In a quiet corner of the library, removed from the soft murmurs of scholars and the gentle clatter of instruments, lay a collection devoted entirely to contemplation and human thought, the scrolls of philosophy. Here, the accumulated wisdom of countless minds was preserved, inviting readers to linger over the slow unfolding of ideas, to reflect, and to let the mind wander along the calm paths of reason and imagination. Theon first entered this chamber in the late afternoon, when the sun poured golden light through high windows, illuminating the scrolls with a gentle glow. The scent of aged parchment and subtle incense mingled in the air, a quiet reminder that knowledge could be both intellectual and sacred. Shelves rose high toward the ceiling, filled with texts that traced human curiosity, from the earliest musings on nature to profound reflections on morality, existence, and the cosmos. Callista guided Theon past the rows of scrolls, each labeled with care, its surface gently brushed to remove dust. Philosophy, she whispered, is not simply the pursuit of answers, but the art of asking questions. Each scroll here is a conversation across time, inviting us to listen, reflect, and understand. Theon ran his fingers lightly along the edges, feeling the subtle texture of papyrus and the faint impressions of ink, sensing the quiet rhythm of thought preserved in each line. Among the texts were the works of Greek thinkers, Egyptian sages, and scholars from distant lands, each contributing a unique perspective. Theon marveled at the diversity of voices, some practical, concerned with ethics and governance, others abstract, exploring the nature of being, knowledge, or the divine. Yet all were united by a patient rhythm, a gentle unfolding of thought that required calm attention to fully appreciate. Scholars in the chamber moved quietly, seated cross-legged with scrolls unfurled before them. Some took notes, translating ideas into their own words, while others simply read, absorbing the cadence and flow of reasoning. There was no hurry, no sense of competition. The pursuit of understanding was a slow, deliberate process, inviting reflection rather than reaction. Theon noticed how the scrolls themselves were arranged. Texts on logic and argumentation were placed alongside writings on ethics. Contemplations on nature were interspersed with explorations of the human mind. The organization encouraged readers to draw connections, to let one idea echo into another, cultivating a sense of holistic understanding. Even the layout of the text, with careful spacing and margins, allowed the eye to move gracefully, encouraging patience and focus. Some scrolls contained dialogue rather than monologue, presenting philosophical ideas through conversation. Theon imagined the voices of thinkers debating softly, the rhythm of inquiry unfolding like a quiet performance. Questions were posed, answers offered, and subtle counterpoints raised, all without urgency, allowing the reader to absorb the logic and reflect on meaning at their own pace. Callista pointed out texts on ethics and virtue, noting how scholars explored the nature of good living. Some texts guided rulers and citizens alike, while others examined personal conduct, inner reflection, and the cultivation of character. Each argument was carefully reasoned, each example illustrative, yet the tone remained calm and measured. Philosophy here was not a weapon of debate, but a guide to understanding life itself. The chamber also preserved teachings on metaphysics and cosmology. Texts described the nature of reality, the principles underlying the cosmos, and the relationship between human perception and universal truth. These works were intricate, requiring careful thought and multiple readings to grasp fully. Theon observed scholars pausing frequently, letting ideas sink deeply before moving forward, understanding that comprehension could not be rushed. In quiet corners, small groups of philosophers discussed ideas aloud. Their voices were low, deliberate, and rhythmic, as if each word were being weighed for its resonance and clarity. Debates were gentle, reflective, and never rushed. The goal was understanding rather than victory. Theon noted how listening to these exchanges provided insights beyond the text itself. The cadence, pauses, and emphasis carried meaning that ink alone could not convey. The scrolls also contained reflections on mathematics, logic, and natural philosophy. Diagrams and geometric figures accompanied explanations, each line carefully drawn to illuminate abstract concepts. Theon learned that reasoning was intertwined with observation. The study of numbers, patterns, and relationships was a meditation on both thought and the structures underlying the natural world. The library's philosophers did not work alone. They collaborated with astronomers, physicians, and artists, integrating practical knowledge with abstract contemplation. A text on ethics might be informed by observations of the human body. A metaphysical treatise could reference celestial cycles. In this way, philosophy was not isolated, but a living dialogue connecting ideas across disciplines. Even the margins of the scrolls were alive with notes. Students and scholars recorded reflections, questions, and interpretations, creating a layered conversation across generations. Theon understood that the library was not merely a repository of static knowledge. It was a dynamic space where thought was preserved, questioned, and expanded with care and patience. Some scrolls explored the nature of time and memory. Scholars wrote of the impermanence of human experience, the fleeting nature of perception, and the importance of attentive observation. Theon found a quiet resonance in these writings, a gentle reminder to move through life with awareness and reflection, to notice the subtle patterns that connected moments, actions, and thoughts. In the evening, as shadows lengthened and lamps were lit, the chamber exuded a serene calm. Scholars continued to read, their faces illuminated by soft light, the quiet scratching of ink on parchment, blending with the occasional whispered comment. The atmosphere encouraged deep reflection, inviting readers to linger in thought, allowing ideas to settle slowly. like sediment in still water. Theon realized that the scrolls of philosophy were not only about acquiring knowledge, but cultivating a mindful approach to understanding. They taught patience, attentiveness, and the gentle discipline of inquiry. Through careful reading, observation, and discussion, each scholar contributed to a collective awareness, a slow accumulation of wisdom that transcended individual lifetimes. Even minor details were considered meaningful. A carefully chosen word, a subtle illustration, or the rhythm of a dialogue could illuminate a profound truth. Theon noticed how the placement of ideas on the scroll, the sequence of arguments, and the integration of observation and reflection created a delicate balance, guiding the reader gently toward understanding. And so, the philosophers continued their work, day after day, preserving ideas, cultivating insight, and engaging in quiet dialogue across time. In the scrolls of philosophy, the Library of Alexandria held not only words and arguments, but a rhythm of thought, a meditative space for the mind, and a gentle invitation to explore the depths of human understanding with patience, care, and reverent attention. Along the sunlit corridors of the library, in a chamber near the docks of Alexandria, a different kind of knowledge was preserved, the secrets of the seas. Here, navigators, cartographers, and maritime scholars studied the movement of ships, the tides, and the vast expanse of the Mediterranean, recording their observations with meticulous care. The navigators' charts were both practical and contemplative, a gentle blending of science, art, and patient observation. Theon entered the chamber just as the morning sun reflected off the harbor waters, casting a soft, shimmering light through tall windows. The air carried a faint scent of salt, wood, and ink, mingling with the aroma of polished maps and carefully prepared pigments. Long tables were covered with charts depicting coastlines, islands, currents, and depths, each annotated with notes on winds, tides, and seasonal patterns. Callista led Theon to a navigator named Damaris, a quiet woman with eyes that seemed to trace the horizon even indoors. To navigate, she said softly, is to listen to the sea, to observe its rhythm, and to record what is subtle and constant. Every wave, every wind, every star guides us, if we are patient enough to notice. She unrolled a large parchment, revealing a map of the eastern Mediterranean, each curve of the coastline carefully measured, and each harbor marked with precise notation. The navigator's charts were more than static maps. They were living records of observation. Notes in the margins described currents, seasonal winds, and even subtle changes in watercolor that indicated depth or the presence of reefs. Theon marveled at the care taken to record not only what could be measured, but what could only be sensed. The quiet pulse of the sea, the faint shifts that guided sailors safely along distant coasts. Damaris showed Theon the tools of her craft. Compasses, astrolabes, and sounding lines were arranged with deliberate precision. Each instrument was maintained carefully, polished, calibrated, and stored with respect. She demonstrated the use of the astrolabe to measure latitude, tracing the path of the sun or stars with slow, deliberate movements. Each adjustment was gentle, precise, and rhythmically performed, a meditation in motion. Charts were often updated with information gathered from sailors, travelers, and merchants. Reports of shoals, shifting sands, or hidden reefs were carefully verified and incorporated. Theon learned that accuracy required patience. A hasty measurement could mislead, while careful, repeated observation preserved lives and livelihoods. Knowledge of the seas was both practical and sacred, a bond between humanity and nature, recorded with reverent attention. The chamber contained scrolls describing currents, tides, and the phases of the moon. Scholars studied these alongside celestial charts, understanding that navigation required harmony between sea and sky. Observations were made quietly, calculations written slowly, and each note cross-referenced to ensure reliability. Theon realized that this careful, deliberate work was a form of devotion, connecting human endeavor with the rhythms of the natural world. Damaris pointed out annotated maps of distant lands, the Nile Delta, the coastlines of Crete, the harbors of Phoenicia. Each chart told a story, not only of geography, but of human movement, trade, and exploration. The lines on the parchment were more than guides for ships. They were records of journeys, encounters, and careful attention to the world beyond Alexandria. The chamber also preserved knowledge of the stars as guides for navigation. Astronomers' charts were consulted alongside sea maps to determine position and course. Theon observed how navigators measured angles of celestial bodies, timed observations, and recorded data methodically, understanding that precision was essential in both calculation and interpretation. Even the smallest details were significant. Symbols indicated safe harbors, dangerous reefs, or currents strong enough to carry a ship off course. Notes in fine script described the sound of water over sandbars, the behavior of birds that might signal land, or the subtle change in wind patterns before a storm. The navigator's charts were repositories not only of knowledge, but of careful sensory awareness, requiring patience, observation, and respect for natural rhythms. Theon also noticed the artistry embedded in the charts. Coastlines were drawn with flowing lines, islands depicted with gentle shading, and waves suggested with subtle curves. Maps were both functional and beautiful, blending observation with aesthetic consideration. This artistry was not frivolous. It encouraged careful attention and reflection, helping navigators internalize the shape and rhythm of the world they traversed. Sailors often contributed to the charts, describing their experiences in soft, measured detail. Their words were transcribed by scholars, integrated with careful measurements, and stored alongside the maps themselves. The process was slow and deliberate, emphasizing accuracy, clarity, and the preservation of collective experience. Each map was a living document, evolving with new insight, yet always guided by patience and attentive care. Damaris sometimes guided students in exercises to trace imagined routes, calculate distances, and estimate travel times. Each step was performed with calm concentration, fostering both skill and reflection. Errors were seen as opportunities to refine observation, not as failures, reinforcing a philosophy of learning that valued patience and careful attention over haste. In the evening, the chamber took on a special quiet. Lamps cast warm pools of light across the maps, and shadows played along the carefully inscribed coastlines. Theon would linger, tracing lines with his fingers, imagining ships moving slowly across the sea, guided by wind, tide, and star. He felt the vastness of the ocean and the quiet responsibility of recording its patterns, sensing a rhythm that connected human endeavor to the eternal pulse of the world. The navigator's charts reminded Theon that knowledge was not merely a collection of facts, but a careful dialogue with nature. Observation, recording, and reflection created understanding, linking human intention with natural rhythms. Each map was a meditation, a story, and a guide, a quiet testament to patience, precision, and respect for the vast and ever-changing seas. And so, the navigators continued their work, day after day, documenting coastlines, currents, and stars, preserving a delicate understanding of the seas for generations to come. Through their calm, attentive efforts, the Library of Alexandria held not only the knowledge of lands and waters, but also a gentle rhythm of observation, contemplation, and reverent stewardship of the natural world, ensuring that even the vast oceans could be understood through patience, care, and quiet wonder. Hidden in a quiet wing of the library, away from the rustle of scrolls and the soft footfalls of scholars, there existed a chamber devoted entirely to sound, to the preservation of voices, chants and music that carried knowledge, culture, and ritual through time. Here, the conservators of sound worked gently and meticulously, recording the subtle rhythms of language and the delicate cadences of oral traditions that might otherwise vanish with passing generations. Theon entered the chamber just as a soft breeze drifted through an open window, carrying the faint scent of the sea and the distant murmur of city life. The room was bathed in soft golden light, which fell upon shelves lined with carefully wound scrolls. clay tablets inscribed with musical notation, and vessels containing resonant tones that could be struck or plucked to produce a controlled vibration. The air itself seemed to hum softly, as though the library held the memory of countless sounds within its stone walls. Callista led Theon past rows of instruments and manuscripts, whispering, "Sound is ephemeral. It fades as quickly as it is made. Our task is to preserve it, to capture the rhythm, tone, and intent of voices, chants, and music, so that future generations may hear the past as we do now." Theon could almost hear the echoes of ancient voices drifting through the chamber as he moved, a gentle murmur woven into the quiet of the room. The conservators of sound approached their work with both patience and reverence. Some scholars sat cross-legged, intently listening to recordings made on thin, resonant reeds, transcribing the subtle inflections and pauses into written notation. Others practiced chants or recited poetry, carefully noting variations in pitch, rhythm, and timbre. The act of recording was deliberate. Every word, every pause, every tonal shift was considered precious. Theon observed an elderly conservator, Sophonias, gently striking a set of small bronze bowls, each producing a distinct note. "Sound has memory," he murmured, "but only if it is captured carefully. Listen to the decay of the note, the subtle resonance that lingers. That is where history speaks." Theon leaned closer, letting the gentle reverberations fill his awareness. Each tone was delicate yet full, like a soft wave caressing a stone shore. In one corner, young apprentices practiced reciting epic poems in measured, even tones. Their voices were guided by the experienced conservators, emphasizing clarity, rhythm, and emotion, while maintaining the subtle nuances that preserved the original character of the work. Mistakes were not scolded, but corrected with gentle repetition, encouraging patience and attentiveness. The chamber held scrolls of notation for chants, hymns, and ceremonial recitations. Some described sacred rituals, with instructions on the precise timing and pitch of each syllable. Others recorded folk songs, proverbs, or stories told by travelers from distant lands. Theon noticed how these texts blended linguistic detail with musical notation, capturing the interplay of sound, rhythm, and meaning. Each scroll was a delicate tapestry of knowledge, preserved for careful study and reverent practice. The conservators of sound also collaborated with other scholars. Astronomers recorded chants tied to celestial events, noting how songs might accompany observations of solstices or eclipses. Physicians consulted rhythmic recitations for therapeutic purposes, believing that sound could harmonize the body and mind. Artists collaborated to integrate musical performance with visual storytelling. In this way, sound became a living, multi-dimensional thread connecting knowledge across disciplines. Theon was fascinated by the delicate instruments used in preservation. Lyres, flutes, and small percussion instruments were tuned precisely, sometimes to match a specific chant or harmonic pattern. Ancient reed devices allowed sounds to be captured more permanently, and the conservators devised methods to play and replay them with minimal alteration. Each device required careful handling, cleaning, and adjustment, reflecting a philosophy that honored both the instrument and the sound it produced. Some recordings were of spoken knowledge, stories, histories, and philosophical discourses delivered aloud. The conservators noted pauses, emphases, and subtle vocal inflections, understanding that meaning often resided in the rhythm and tone of delivery rather than solely in the words themselves. Theon listened to a soft recitation of a tale from a distant land, marveling at how the story seemed to float in the air, gentle and immersive, carrying the listener through both narrative and sound. Even the smallest details mattered. A breath between words, a soft inflection at the end of a sentence, or a deliberate emphasis on a single syllable could alter understanding and emotional resonance. Theon realized that the conservators treated sound as a living, delicate entity, preserving it not just as communication, but as an experience of memory and culture. In the evening, the chamber took on a serene stillness. lamps cast pools of light on scrolls and instruments, while the faint murmur of recorded chants provided a soft, continuous backdrop. Theon would sit quietly, letting the patterns of sound wash over him, tracing the rhythm of ancient voices and melodies, feeling the continuity of human expression across generations. Callista explained that the work of the conservators of sound extended beyond preservation. It was a form of attentive meditation, a practice in listening deeply, recording carefully, and understanding the ephemeral nature of communication. Knowledge, she said, exists not only in written text, but in the way it is spoken, sung, and resonated, and the chamber ensured that these patterns would endure, gently carrying voices of the past into the future. Theon realized that sound connected both memory and emotion. A simple chant, carefully preserved, could evoke reflection, calm, and wonder. A recited story could carry wisdom, rhythm, and atmosphere simultaneously. The library's preservation of sound was an invitation to experience history, not only intellectually, but sensorially, allowing the listener to inhabit the past through the delicate medium of human expression. Even minor tonal variations were meaningful. The rise and fall of a phrase, the softness of a syllable, or the pause between words was observed, recorded, and noted with care. Theon understood that attention to these subtle details was an act of reverence, preserving the soul of the knowledge itself. And so, the conservators of sound continued their work, quietly, patiently, and attentively, ensuring that the voices of the past, from chants to stories, from instruction to song, would endure. Through their delicate, reverent efforts, the Library of Alexandria preserved not only words and numbers, but the gentle, resonant patterns of human expression, allowing future generations to hear, feel, and reflect upon the echoes of history with calm wonder. Beyond the marble halls and quiet chambers of scrolls and instruments, the Library of Alexandria extended into open courtyards and gardens, spaces where the mind and senses could wander freely. These gardens were carefully cultivated sanctuaries, a blend of aesthetic beauty, medicinal utility, and contemplative design. Scholars and visitors moved among flowering paths, inhaling subtle fragrances, observing delicate plants, and reflecting in the soft embrace of nature. Theon stepped into the main garden on a morning when dew still clung to the petals, and the sun had only just begun to warm the stone paths. The air was cool and fragrant, carrying the scent of herbs, flowering trees, and the subtle aroma of wet soil. Paths of polished stone wound through the garden, guiding visitors past carefully arranged beds of lavender, rosemary, sage, and thyme. Each plant was labeled with its uses, medicinal, culinary, or symbolic, and the gardens served both practical and contemplative purposes. Callista led Theon past a small fountain at the center of the courtyard, its water flowing gently over smooth stones, creating a soft, continuous murmur. "This is more than beauty," she explained. "Each plant, each stone, each pattern of the garden is a lesson. We learn from the rhythm of growth, the cycles of nature, and the quiet patience required to cultivate life." Theon watched as the sun glinted off droplets of water, catching the delicate wings of early morning bees that hovered from flower to flower. Medicinal plants were a focus of study. Scholars examined leaves, flowers, and roots, recording their properties, uses, and preparation methods. Scrolls in nearby chambers described remedies for ailments ranging from minor discomforts to more serious conditions, linking observation with practical care. Theon admired the careful attention to detail. Every plant's shape, texture, and scent was noted, often accompanied by illustrations rendered in the quiet precision of the artist's alcove. The garden was also a place of contemplation and quiet reflection. Benches, shaded by fig trees and colonnades, provided spaces for scholars to read, meditate, or discuss ideas in soft, measured tones. The gentle rustle of leaves, the hum of bees, and the soft splash of water created a natural rhythm, encouraging calm thought and attentive observation. Theon found that walking slowly among the garden paths allowed his mind to settle, aligning with the deliberate pace of study and reflection encouraged throughout the library. Some areas were dedicated to ornamental plants, chosen for their aesthetic qualities or symbolic significance. Vibrant flowers and climbing vines adorned stone trellises, while small groves provided shaded retreats. Callista pointed out symbolic arrangements, plants whose forms represented virtues, cycles of life, or philosophical principles. Visitors were encouraged to observe not only the scientific or medicinal aspects of the garden, but its subtle visual and symbolic lessons. In quieter corners, scholars recorded the interactions of insects and birds with plants, noting pollination patterns, behavior, and seasonal changes. These observations were carefully transcribed and sometimes illustrated, contributing to broader knowledge of the natural world. Theon noticed how even the smallest details were appreciated. The curve of a leaf, the subtle pattern of veins, or the movement of a bee from flower to flower was worthy of study and reflection. The garden was arranged to encourage wandering, discovery, and gentle surprise. Hidden alcoves and winding paths revealed benches, sculptures, or clusters of rare plants. Scholars often used these spaces to pause, write, or meditate on ideas encountered in the scrolls. Theon learned that the design of the garden reflected the same philosophy as the library itself. Knowledge, beauty, and contemplation were intertwined, each enhancing the other. Water played an essential role in both aesthetics and study. Fountains, reflecting pools, and small channels were designed to maintain humidity for certain plants and to create a calming atmosphere. The sound of flowing water guided footsteps, provided subtle auditory cues for reflection, and symbolized the continuous movement of knowledge, ever flowing, adapting, and nourishing life. In addition to study and reflection, the garden provided material for the practical sciences. Leaves, roots, and flowers were harvested carefully for experiments in medicine, dye preparation, or culinary use. Apprentices were taught to handle plants gently, to observe patterns of growth, and to integrate their findings into the broader collection of library knowledge. Every action was deliberate, emphasizing patience, observation, and respect. Theon was particularly struck by the interplay of light and shadow. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating moving patterns on stone paths and scrolls left open for study. The soft illumination encouraged calm reading and reflection, and the subtle shifts of light over the course of the day mirrored the natural rhythms that the scholars sought to understand and integrate into their lives. The garden also hosted philosophical discussions. Small groups would sit under pergolas, debating ethics, metaphysics, or observations of nature. The gentle hum of the garden's life, the breeze, the birdsong, the trickle of water, provided a quiet backdrop that encouraged slow, thoughtful conversation. Theon noted that ideas seemed to emerge more clearly here than in the confined chambers, as though the living space itself inspired reflection. Even minor details were not overlooked. The precise spacing of plants, the alignment of stones, and the selection of species reflected an awareness of aesthetics, balance, and natural cycles. Observing these details nurtured attention and mindfulness, teaching that understanding emerges not only from text, but from the subtle patterns and rhythms of the world itself. In the evening, as shadows lengthened and the sun set, the garden of knowledge transformed into a place of gentle stillness. Fountains murmured softly, lamps were lit along the stone paths, and the scent of herbs deepened in the cool air. Scholars lingered, writing, reading, or quietly contemplating, as the day's lessons merged with the serenity of the garden. The rhythm of life, study, and reflection flowed together in quiet harmony. Theon realized that the garden of knowledge was more than a physical space. It was a sanctuary for the mind, body, and spirit, where observation, study, and contemplation coexisted. Here, one could walk slowly, observe patiently, and reflect deeply, connecting with both the cycles of nature and the accumulated wisdom of human experience. And so, the scholars and visitors continued their quiet work in the garden, day after day, preserving knowledge, cultivating plants, and allowing thought to unfold gently. Through careful attention, reverence, and calm practice, the Library of Alexandria extended its embrace beyond stone walls and scrolls, creating a living sanctuary where learning and contemplation could flourish in harmony with the rhythms of nature, offering a serene path toward understanding, insight, and gentle wonder. Beyond the well-lit halls, the scrolls, and the gardens of Alexandria, there existed a group of individuals whose work was largely unseen but indispensable: the silent guardians. These custodians, archivists, and preservationists dedicated their lives to the careful maintenance of knowledge, ensuring that the treasures of the library endured, page by page, scroll by scroll, generation after generation. Theon followed Callista into a quiet corridor lined with shelves stretching high into shadowed recesses. The air was cool and faintly scented with ink and aged papyrus. Here the lamps were dimmer, and the gentle rustle of robes or the faint scrape of a hand across parchment was the only sound. The silent guardians moved with deliberate calm, as though even a hurried step might disturb the fragile flow of time preserved in the scrolls. These custodians were responsible for an array of tasks that required patience, precision, and reverence. Scrolls were inspected daily for signs of decay. Papyrus that had begun to fray at the edges was carefully repaired with fine threads or supported by clean layers of new material. Ink that was fading was noted, and when necessary, scholars would create copies, transferring the essence of the original with utmost care, preserving not only content, but the unique character of handwriting and annotation. Theon observed a young archivist, Irenaeus, carefully unrolling a large map and laying it on a table. He examined the scroll under a soft lamp, noting even the faintest discolorations or wrinkles. With the gentlest touch, he flattened the edges, aligned the margins, and made a record of its condition in meticulous detail. There was a quiet dignity in these actions, a reverence for the centuries of human thought held within each fragile fiber. Some silent guardians specialized in cleaning and environmental care. They regulated humidity, airflow, and light exposure, understanding that even the smallest change in temperature or moisture could hasten decay. Theon watched as one guardian adjusted shutters to moderate the sunlight streaming onto delicate manuscripts, moving slowly and deliberately, aware of the subtle dance between preservation and natural light. Other guardians focused on cataloging. Each scroll, tablet, and artifact was labeled, described, and indexed with a system designed for both precision and accessibility. The catalog was not only a guide, but a living record, capturing the history of acquisition, use, and restoration. Marginal notes were recorded alongside descriptions of content, author, provenance, and even previous restorations, creating a layered history that allowed scholars to trace the life of each document through time. The silent guardians were trained in multiple disciplines. They studied calligraphy, understanding the unique strokes and rhythms of different scribes. They learned chemistry to preserve pigments, knowledge of plants to craft natural inks and adhesives, and even a gentle understanding of philosophy to interpret texts without disturbing their essence. Their work was a convergence of art, science, and patience, carried out with quiet devotion. Theon noticed that the guardians worked in teams, often in silence. When one read a damaged scroll aloud for transcription, another would carefully copy it by hand, while a third ensured that environmental conditions remained stable. Their movements were coordinated, rhythmic, and almost ceremonial, a choreography that allowed knowledge to endure without haste or interruption. Small errors were approached with calm attention rather than frustration. A misaligned line of text or a torn edge was treated with care, studied, and corrected patiently. Even the act of correcting was performed as an exercise in mindfulness, reinforcing the understanding that knowledge, like life, required gentle stewardship. Some guardians were responsible for more delicate collections, illuminated texts, musical scores, or rare artifacts. They used soft brushes to remove dust, cotton cloths to polish surfaces, and wooden supports to prevent sagging or bending. Every touch was measured and intentional, acknowledging the fragility and historical significance of the items in their care. Theon was particularly fascinated by the scrolls containing annotations from previous generations. Notes from ancient scholars, in faint ink, created a subtle dialogue across centuries. The Silent Guardians preserved these comments with reverence, understanding that they represented not only content, but the lived engagement of minds long past. Even the smallest mark on a margin was a bridge connecting past and present, demanding patience and respect. In the evening, the Chamber of Guardians glowed with soft lamplight. Shadows from shelves and instruments danced across the walls, and the quiet murmur of consultation, sometimes a whispered instruction or a shared observation, filled the air. The atmosphere was one of calm concentration, where every gesture was purposeful and every movement carried the weight of care and history. The Silent Guardians also guided scholars in handling delicate materials. They instructed visitors on proper techniques for unrolling scrolls, turning pages, and supporting fragile artifacts. Their voice was gentle but firm, instilling respect for the object and patience for the task. Theon noticed that even simple lessons in handling a scroll became exercises in mindfulness, reinforcing the philosophy of deliberate observation and careful action. Some guardians were experts in restoration. They studied the chemical composition of inks, the fibers of papyrus, and the pigments of illustrations, ensuring that repair methods did not compromise original materials. Restoration was not about altering history, but allowing it to endure, preserving both content and character. Each action was deliberate, slow, and contemplative, emphasizing patience over haste. Theon observed that these custodians often worked late into the night. The quiet of darkness allowed focus, and the soft glow of lamps created a contemplative environment. The gentle scratch of quill on parchment, the soft brushing of fibers, and the subtle movement of hands across scrolls became a rhythm almost meditative, guiding both guardian and scholar into a shared experience of calm attention and reverent care. Even minor details were honored. Marginal notes, tiny tears, subtle discolorations, and the order of scrolls on a shelf were all attended to with care. Theon understood that this dedication to detail was a philosophy in itself, that knowledge, once entrusted to human hands, demanded respect, patience, and continuous attention to endure across time. Through their work, the Silent Guardians ensured that Alexandria's library was more than a repository of information. It was a living archive, a sanctuary where knowledge, culture, and human thought were preserved with reverence and care. Each scroll, each tablet, each artifact carried not only content, but the legacy of patience, devotion, and mindful stewardship. And so, the Silent Guardians continued their quiet labor, day after day, ensuring that the treasures of the library would endure. Their dedication created a rhythm of preservation, a gentle continuity of care that allowed the accumulated wisdom of generations to survive. Through their measured, attentive work, the Library of Alexandria remained a sanctuary where knowledge could be experienced, studied, and cherished, a testament to the quiet, enduring power of patience, reverence, and gentle attention. Even as the Library of Alexandria stood in its grand form, the scholars, custodians, and navigators within understood that the preservation of knowledge was not eternal by nature. Every scroll, tablet, and instrument bore the subtle risk of decay, fire, or neglect. Yet the flame of memory, the quiet commitment to recording, sharing, and reflecting, glowed brightly, illuminating the minds of those who tended it. Theon wandered through the main halls during a quiet afternoon, sunlight filtering through tall windows, dust motes dancing like tiny stars in the air. The soft echo of his footsteps mingled with distant whispers of scholars reading aloud. He paused to observe the careful hands of an archivist restoring an aged manuscript, realizing that each gesture was a conversation with the past, a gesture of fidelity, and a promise to future generations. Callista guided Theon to a secluded chamber where illuminated scrolls were displayed, their margins filled with notes and commentaries accumulated over decades. Memory, she said, is not only in what is written, but in what is observed, discussed, and preserved. Each person who touches these texts contributes a heartbeat to the library. Theon leaned closer to examine the delicate script, noticing the faint annotations left by travelers, scholars, and visitors, each a trace of thought and reflection. The flame of memory, as Callista called it, was cultivated in many forms. Some was in written scrolls, carefully organized and catalogued. Some resided in the charts, maps, and instruments that recorded the world's complexities. Some flickered in the gardens, where medicinal plants and quiet spaces encouraged reflection, linking nature's rhythms with human understanding. And some lived in sound, chants, recitations, and songs, preserved for future ears to hear and hearts to feel. Theon marveled at the interconnectedness of these elements. Knowledge was not isolated. Mathematics informed astronomy, astronomy guided navigation, poetry intertwined with philosophy, and medicinal observation depended on both plant and human study. The library itself became a living organism, a network of thought, observation, and reflection, sustained by the collective attention of those who tended it with quiet reverence. Even the smallest contributions mattered. A single note added to a margin could clarify a previous observation. A corrected measurement on a navigational chart could prevent future error. A carefully preserved sound, a single, well-maintained plant, a tidied shelf. Each act of care was a spark in the enduring flame of memory, ensuring that the essence of human curiosity and observation remained alight. Theon spent hours tracing these delicate threads. He watched as a scholar compared astronomical calculations with recorded charts of the Nile, while another transcribed oral accounts of travelers' observations. Nearby, a conservator gently restored a map, ensuring its accuracy and readability. Everything was intertwined, every action a small act of continuity, every preserved detail a quiet victory against the erosion of time. Callista explained that the flame of memory was not only practical, but philosophical. We do not preserve knowledge simply to possess it. We preserve it to understand our place in the world, to connect with those who came before, and to offer guidance to those who will come after. Each scroll, each note, each careful observation is a bridge across generations. Theon felt the weight and warmth of this truth, sensing that the library was more than its walls and collections. It was a vessel for human consciousness, patience, and hope. He wandered to a window overlooking the harbor, watching ships drift slowly along the calm waters. The sea, Callista said softly, is like memory itself, ever moving, vast, sometimes hidden, sometimes revealed. And like the sea, knowledge requires care, attention, and respect. Those who tend it are guardians, observers, and interpreters. Theon inhaled the gentle salt breeze and imagined the countless journeys recorded in maps and charts, each a testament to human curiosity and the desire to understand the world. In the evening, the library glowed with a serene atmosphere. Lamps cast a warm light on shelves and desks. The soft rustle of pages filled the air, and the distant murmur of scholars' voices provided a gentle accompaniment. The flame of memory seemed to permeate every corner, a quiet energy that encouraged focus, reflection, and reverent attention to the details of life, nature, and knowledge. Even as some scrolls deteriorated or were damaged, the principle of preservation endured. New copies were made, knowledge was shared, and understanding evolved. The library had become a living testament to the human desire to remember, to study, and to honor the continuity of thought. Each act of careful observation or transcription was a tiny flame, contributing to a larger, enduring illumination. Theon realized that the flame of memory was not merely a metaphor, but a lived experience within the library. Every scholar, custodian, and navigator contributed to its glow. Every chart, scroll, sound, and plant became a vessel for continuity, connecting past, present, and future. In this way, the library was more than a repository. It was a sanctuary, a teacher, and a quiet guardian of human curiosity and reflection. Callista led Theon to a small alcove where a single candle burned. Its its flame steady against the darkness of the evening. "Even a small flame," she whispered, "can illuminate vast spaces. So too, each act of preservation, study, or reflection brightens the understanding of the generations that follow." Theon watched the gentle flicker and felt a profound calm, as if the library itself breathed slowly, in harmony with the rhythms of thought, memory, and human endeavor. Theon understood then that the library's legacy was not measured solely by the survival of scrolls or instruments, but by the cultivation of attentive care, curiosity, and reverent observation. The flame of memory was eternal, not because the library could endure unscathed, but because its principles had been embedded in minds, practices, and hearts. It lived wherever knowledge was approached with patience, respect, and love. And so, as night settled over Alexandria, the scholars, custodians, and observers continued their quiet work. The soft glow of lamps illuminated careful hands, gentle words, and thoughtful gestures. Through patient attention and reverent care, the flame of memory remained alive, a quiet, enduring light that connected humanity across time, ensuring that even the smallest acts of knowledge could resonate through generations, offering calm wonder, reflection, and the gentle assurance that the past could guide the present and inspire the future. As the centuries slowly turned, the Library of Alexandria, once a bustling sanctuary of knowledge, scholarship, and wonder, began to experience the subtle passage of time, like a river gradually changing course. Its halls, filled with scrolls and instruments, gardens and conservatories, carried echoes of voices, the soft whisper of pages, and the gentle hum of curiosity. Yet, even in the quietest moments, there was a sense that nothing, not even the most carefully preserved knowledge, could remain untouched by the flow of history. Theon wandered through the empty corridors one late afternoon, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows on marble floors and wooden shelves. Dust had begun to settle in corners, and a faint creak echoed as he stepped carefully over the uneven stones. The air was still, carrying only a faint trace of papyrus, ink, and the lingering scent of herbs from the gardens. It was a profound silence, one that invited reflection, as if the library itself was speaking softly, reminding him of the impermanence of all things. Callista walked beside him, her steps measured, almost reverent. "Even silence is a keeper of knowledge," she said. "Though the voices may fade and the scrolls may decay, the essence of what was learned and observed remains, carried in memory, in practice, and in the traces left behind for those who seek to understand." Theon listened, feeling the weight of generations, the patience, curiosity, and care that had flowed through every corridor, every chamber, and every garden of the library. In this silence, Theon felt the presence of the countless scholars, custodians, and visitors who had devoted their lives to understanding the world. Their footsteps, now echoes, had once traversed the same halls, turning pages, recording observations, and sharing insights. The work of the silent guardians, the conservators of sound, the navigators, and the gardeners had left an invisible thread connecting every generation, a delicate lattice of memory and care. Even as the library faced the inevitability of loss, fires, neglect, or simple decay, its influence had already spread far beyond the walls of marble and stone. Ideas recorded on fragile scrolls traveled with scholars to distant lands, inspiring thought, reflection, and learning in other centers of civilization. The flame of memory, cultivated with such patience, had ignited sparks elsewhere, ensuring that knowledge, in some form, endured. Theon entered the central hall, once filled with scholars poring over scrolls, now quiet, empty, and bathed in soft, fading light. He ran his hand gently along the spines of carefully arranged scrolls, feeling the subtle textures of papyrus, ink, and vellum. Each scroll was a vessel of thought, observation, and creativity, a quiet testament to human curiosity. Though some texts were lost, the remaining traces were luminous, revealing the depth of inquiry and the continuity of thought across generations. In a corner, Theon discovered a small pile of scattered notes, partially damaged, but still legible. He carefully lifted a sheet, tracing the delicate script with his fingers. It was a mathematical observation, a philosophical note, a reflection on the stars. Even in fragmented form, the knowledge resonated, a quiet reminder that learning, once sparked, could endure beyond physical form, carried in memory, conversation, and the written word. Callista led Theon toward the gardens, now quieter, shadows lengthening over paths and fountains. The gentle sound of water, still flowing despite the absence of daily visitors, created a soft, reflective rhythm. The trees, plants, and flowers had grown in their natural cycles, untended yet resilient, much like the essence of the knowledge preserved here. Nature itself seemed to continue the work of the library, embodying rhythms, cycles, and patterns that mirrored human observation and understanding. The eternal silence, as Callista described it, was not empty. It was a space of reflection, a sacred pause in which the past whispered its lessons. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant hum of the sea, and the faint creak of stone provided subtle cues, inviting thought, attention, and introspection. The library's presence, even in quiet decay, encouraged contemplation of impermanence, continuity, and the enduring power of human curiosity. Theon wandered further, noticing faint traces of light and shadow playing across columns, arches, and walls. These patterns reminded him of the meticulous attention that had gone into every detail of the library: the arrangement of scrolls, the placement of instruments, the alignment of gardens, and the careful observation of natural cycles. The design, he realized, was itself a lesson in patience, harmony, and reverence for the natural and intellectual world. Even as the library faced inevitable decline, the principles it embodied, meticulous care, deep observation, curiosity, and the quiet preservation of knowledge, persisted. Scholars who had once walked these halls had carried ideas outward. Students in distant lands learned from manuscripts that had traveled far. Oral traditions, chants, and sound patterns had inspired new generations of thought. The essence of Alexandria lived on, not in bricks and mortar alone, but in the human endeavor to know, record, and reflect. Theon paused at the entrance to the main chamber, looking back at the vast, silent space. He imagined the countless scholars, archivists, and guardians who had once worked here, their lives interwoven with the library's rhythm. Even in silence, their dedication, curiosity, and care remained palpable, like a subtle vibration beneath the quiet air. The eternal silence was not emptiness. It was presence, memory, and enduring resonance. Callista placed a gentle hand on Theon's shoulder. The library may not remain in its original form, but its spirit endures. Knowledge, once discovered and shared, cannot be fully extinguished. Each act of study, preservation, and reflection is a spark, carried forward by those who continue to seek understanding. Theon nodded, sensing the truth in her words, feeling the continuity of generations within the quiet grandeur of the library's space. As night fell, lamps were extinguished, and the last traces of daylight faded from the marble halls. The eternal silence settled over the library, complete yet not empty, heavy with memory, yet gentle in its presence. Every scroll, every note, every shadow and echo contributed to a quiet symphony, a testament to human curiosity, care, and reverence. And so, even in the face of time's inevitability, the Library of Alexandria remained a sanctuary, a living memory, a quiet inspiration, and a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, when approached with patience, respect, and love, creates a resonance that can endure across centuries, whispering softly to those willing to listen, reflect, and wonder.